Chapter 104. Headmaster. Jack and the others immediately bowed and went to the side. They became very reserved. After all, before the headmaster, they were unable to speak as they had earlier. Only Lilia continued to stand next to Feng Xinjian in a carefree manner. The headmaster looked at Feng Xinjian, who was lying on the bed, and asked, "Are you all right? The governor asked me to send his regards on his behalf." Sigh, if not for the fact that he had something to attend to at the last minute, he would have come personally to send his regards. "Thank you for your concern, headmaster and governor. Sigh, this is all my fault. I had not expected that Charlie would be so deranged and almost harmed you. If something had happened to you, it would be all my fault." Headmaster Jackson said, "Don't worry, this matter is not over yet. That Charlie will be taught a good lesson." For him to say something like this with his status as the headmaster, it was clear that Jackson had made up his mind to teach Charlie a good lesson. With his status and connections, it was clear that he was very confident in saying something like this. Hearing the word governor, both Jack and Anthony were speechless. What kind of person was the governor? He was an important character who was in charge of the promotion, education, prefectural selection, and regional selection of a region's knights. He could be said to be the top character in a region. To think that such a person would also send his regards to Feng Xinjian? The gazes of the two of them looked at Feng Xinjian with even greater admiration. The pupils of Dick, Ferdinand, and the others narrowed. They had not expected that even the governor would be alarmed by this matter, and that he had almost come to send his regards to Feng Xinjian. If this were to really happen, then not just in Kurst, even in the entire Great Western region, Feng Xinjian would be able to do whatever he wanted. At this moment, in the hearts of Ferdinand and the others, Feng Xinjian's name was once again heavily marked as someone not to be trifled with. Robert and Boris were a little less sensitive, but they knew how respected the governor's status was. A person who led thousands of knights in the Great Western region would be able to suppress them with just a few words. Lilia was also extremely astonished. She had not expected that even the governor would be concerned about Feng Xinjian. Although she was a simple person, she had been born an aristocrat since young, and her father was Kurst's city lord. She understood the concept of a governor better than anyone else. In this world, being in charge of a knight was equivalent to being a high official in charge of a region. Furthermore, this matter regarding Feng Xinjian could be said to have reached the heavens. Everyone started to silently mourn for Charlie. Even though the Knight Association was in charge of supervising all the knights in the world, offending a governor would not end well for him. Just as the headmaster was consoling Feng Xinjian, someone knocked on the door. Charlie walked in with an uneasy expression. Behind him were two conferred knights who were in charge of interrogating him, guarding him. Everyone looked at him in surprise. The dean frowned and said, "Get out." "Dean Jackson, listen to me," Charlie pleaded. "I know that this matter is my fault. I just hope that you guys can give me a chance to make it up to you." The headmaster narrowed his eyes and threw a glance at Feng Xinjian. Feng Xinjian nodded and waved his hand at Charlie. Charlie quickly walked up and said in a soft voice, "Brother Xinjian, I know that I've acted rashly this time around. Don't worry, I'm not here to ask for your forgiveness. I just want to make it up to you." He had thought it through on the way here. It was clearly impossible to ask Feng Xinjian to say that he had not done anything wrong. Therefore, he had only wanted to express his goodwill and ease the tension between them. Feng Xinjian smiled coldly, looked at Charlie, and said, "Brother? Do you think you're fit to be my brother?" As he spoke, his right leg kept on flashing. Two loud bangs rang out from Charlie's knees, and he was forced to his knees. The distance was too close, or it could be said that Charlie had not expected Feng Xinjian to attack him directly. Or it could also be that the continuous 7 days of interrogation had caused his mental and physical state to hit rock bottom. Moreover, with Feng Xinjian's speed, Charlie had not been able to react and had been kicked twice by Fang Xinjian. The fact that he had been able to become a conferred knight showed that he had extraordinary talent. Since young, when had he ever suffered such humiliation? His face immediately flushed red, and his eyes turned bloodshot as he glared at Fang Xinjian. He stood up abruptly, clenched his teeth, and said, "You!" The headmaster took a step forward and walked up to him and Fang Xinjian. He looked at them coldly, and the killing intent in his eyes was self-evident. Fang Xinjian asked, "You what? You?" Green veins popped up on Charlie's forehead, and the muscles on his hands kept on twitching. He clenched his fists tightly, and his chest heaved up and down. A few seconds later, he squeezed out a few words from the gaps between his teeth. "Well done, well done. Xinjian, since you're not in a good mood today, I'll come back in a few days. But your coma really has nothing to do with me." With that, he turned his head, as if he could see the mockery in everyone's eyes. In the depths of Charlie's eyes, there was a crazed killing intent. With a dash, he turned into a series of afterimages and left. It was clear that he did not wish to stay here for even a minute or a second longer. Everyone in the surroundings looked at this scene in a daze. To think that Fang Xinjian, a level 10 knight who had just completed his first transition, had kicked a conferred knight until he was kneeling on the ground, and that conferred knight had only dared to leave dejectedly? In that instant, Zhou Yong and Carter exchanged a glance, their eyes filled with terror. They had yet to apologize to Fang Xinjian. Barbara then recalled how the governor had greeted Fang Xinjian earlier, and her countenance changed, a hint of regret appearing in her eyes. Lilia was the only one who laughed out loud as if nothing had happened. "Well done. It's so satisfying. Teacher, you were so cool just now." The headmaster shook his head helplessly and smiled bitterly. "Those 2 kicks of yours made it hard for me to strike again. And you even hit a conferred knight directly. Your guts are really—" At this moment, Fang Xinjian only felt a coolness in his mind, as well as an unprecedented sense of tranquility. As he calmed down, his thoughts reached a level of clarity that he had never experienced before. He looked at his stats window. After this period of training in the Ice Age meditation art, in addition to those 2 kicks from earlier, he had achieved a huge breakthrough in his proficiency. He was just a little bit away from reaching level 3. At that time, his thinking ability, calculation ability, and memory would all be improved once again. The headmaster mumbled softly, "If this guy had retaliated earlier, then he'd be a mediocre person. But since he could endure this, then all the more we can't let him off." What he was even more suspicious about was how Charlie, a conferred knight with both his strength, agility, and physical strength all being above 100 points, could have been brought to his knees by Fang Xinjian with just 2 kicks. And if Charlie had taken advantage of the situation to do so earlier, it showed how great his tolerance was. Such a person would naturally be even more dangerous. Charlie had clearly not expected that not only had his performance not reduced his punishment, but it had also incited the headmaster's killing intent. The journey to the southern borders would be fraught with danger. Everyone chatted for a while more before the headmaster waved his hand and said, all right. Everyone disperse. Don't disturb Xinjian's rest." Everyone left one by one, but before Lilia left, she was called over by Fang Xinjian, who asked, "Then who's in first place in the interclass competition?" Lilia waved her small fist and said, "It's that guy from class 248, the class with the longest period of cultivation, 8 years more than class 256. Initially, the headmaster had paused the competition, wanting to continue after you were freed from the hands of those people from the association. But then you fainted, so the competition continued. Those B** stards are so annoying. They met your class in the semifinals, and even though they knew that you weren't around, they still put on airs. They could have won immediately, but they still beat up Jack, Anthony, and the others. Even Barbara was intentionally dislocated and almost taken advantage of. Speaking of these, Lilia grew increasingly furious. She had watched the entire competition from the sidelines, and it could be said to be a complete massacre. Jack and the others had been afraid that they would affect Fang Xinjian's rest, so they had not said anything. However, Lilia had not thought of all this. The more she spoke, the angrier she became. She recounted all the humiliations they had received in the competition, especially how Barbara's arms had been dislocated and thrown around like a ball. Barbara was the only female knight in Class 256, and the other party's provocation was naturally very strong. Fang Xinjian understood that the other party must have thought that he had been taken away by the association and had fallen into a coma. That was why they had acted so brazenly. They had crushed their opponents in the competition and displayed their abilities. He let out a cold laugh, looked at the Ice Age meditation art that was just a step away from leveling up, and asked, "Do you know where they are?" "I don't know." Lilia gave it some thought and said, "But I heard that they're having a gathering tonight to celebrate winning the championship again." With that, she looked at Fang Xinjian with stars in her eyes, a hint of excitement flashing past her face. "Teacher, are you going to beat them up? Bring me along, I'll keep a lookout for you." However, at the next moment, a look of hesitation appeared on her face. "Teacher, why don't you recuperate first? Those guys are all official knights who have been cultivating for 7 or 8 years. I heard from my dad that the strongest among them, the prefectural champion, is probably on par with you." A confident smile broke out on Fang Xinjian's face. Others had thought that not only had he not improved during this period of confinement, his physical strength had even deteriorated. However, no one had expected that not only had his martial arts not deteriorated, but they had also improved. He had also comprehended the specialty of the unparalleled sword intent, and his overall abilities were much stronger than before. Chapter 105. In a huge manor, the place was brightly lit. Over 100 servants were shuttling back and forth, changing all sorts of dishes and cutlery. From time to time, ear-piercing laughter could be heard coming from the dining hall, as well as the sound of cups clinking and people eating and drinking. A servant once again carried a large plate of steak into the dining hall. The entire dining hall was illuminated by over 1,000 candles, making it look as bright as day. A huge dining table over 10 meters long was placed in the middle of the dining hall. Over 10 guests were seated along the dining table, chatting and laughing in an exaggerated manner. A man with short silver hair, who was like a small hill, was sitting quietly at one end of the dining table. His hands were crossed, supporting his chin, and he revealed a calm smile, quietly watching the people eating and drinking at the dining table. The silver-haired man's face was very ordinary. If there was anything special about him, it would be that he was very clean. No, it should be said that his entire person was very clean as a piece of white paper. Whether it was his face, his neck, his hands, or any other part of his body, they were all as clean as spring water in the mountains. Just then, another series of laughter rang out. A strong man raised his wine cup and stood up, raising it towards the silver-haired man and saying, "Let us toast to our team leader, the great Hamel, to celebrate our victory in this year's interclass competition. To the great Hamel! To the great Hamel!" Over 10 men and women at the dining table all stood up, raising their wine cups towards the silver-haired Hamel. The latter smiled, raising his cup and saying, "To our tomorrow! To our tomorrow!" Cheers! Everyone shouted loudly, emptying their cups in one gulp. The people at this table were from Class 248, who were celebrating the champions of the interclass competition. Currently, there were still 8 people from Class 248 who were still studying in the academy. Other than these 8 knights, there were also their respective partners and family members at the table. Another red-browed man laughed out loud. This man's skin was tanned and he was well built. However, the most eye-catching thing about him was that pair of eyebrows that looked like they were burning with flames. As he laughed, he said, "Hee hee, I've finally vented my frustrations these few days. That windstorm sword hero has only been at the first transition for a month, but the entire academy treats him like a treasure. Not only did they give him the best of everything, in order to ensure that he had enough ferocious beasts, they even deducted our share. What a joke, isn't he useless now? What trash. It's a pity that I couldn't fight him and defeat him fair and square. No matter how powerful he is, could he beat all of us by himself? Besides, Boss is also here, someone else said. Of course he won't be able to win against all of us, but the windstorm sword hero is indeed very powerful. Have you ever seen a 16-year-old supersonic? A skinny young man said. Douglas, do you like to contradict me? The red-browed man said angrily. The thin young man called Douglas said, Is there anything wrong with what I said? Even if he can't beat us now, it's very likely that he will surpass us in a few years. This kind of talent is worthy of our respect. Respect my ass. The red-browed man laughed maniacally. He's been crippled by those mad dogs from the association. No matter how much of a genius he is, what's the use? Clearly, the whereabouts of both Governor Devitt and the association's upper echelon were confidential. Most of the people in the academy did not know about the twists and turns of the past 2 days. A lady dressed in leather frowned and said, Actually, it's a pity. I don't mind being friends with a genius like Fang Xinjian. It's just that I didn't expect that such a genius would be harmed by those mad dogs. Another young man with sea-blue hair, who looked like an elegant young master, said unhappily when he heard the lady's words, So what if he's able to transcend the speed of sound at 16? As long as boss killing technique is around, it's useless even if he's twice as fast. Moreover, something like transcending the speed of sound is only valuable during the first transition. When everyone has reached the second transition and their agility attribute has broken through 100 points, coupled with some acceleration specialties and techniques, which conferred Knight can't casually transcend the speed of sound. As he spoke, his tone was filled with disdain and slander toward windstorm sword heroes, as if he hated them to the core. The lady dressed in leather smiled and said, Hee hee, Hailong, I know that your woman's family wants to look for Fang Xinjian. You're carrying your emotions. No matter how unbearable a windstorm sword hero is, it's still a rare and powerful job. It's amazing to be able to transcend the speed of sound at 16. If you're not convinced, you can go and give it a try. It turned out that this elegant young master with sea-blue hair was Hailong, who was in a relationship with the instructor, white-bearded examiner's daughter. Hailong laughed coldly. So what if he's able to transcend the speed of sound? Isn't there a lack of first transition knights with outstanding talent? Only geniuses who are able to live on are geniuses. As for Fang Xinjian, he's already crippled. What's the use of being a genius in the past? And for him to faint from the stimulation of merely interrogating someone, it's like a joke. For someone with such a weak will, it's useless no matter how talented he is. Saying that, he revealed a mysterious smile and said, And do you know who Fang Xinjian has offended this time? The red-browed man asked curiously, Who? Could it be some important character in the imperial capital? It's someone from the royal family. Hailong took another bite of the lamb leg and continued, Therefore, he's doomed this time around. Even if he wakes up, it's useless. If the association can mess with him once, they won't be able to mess with him a second time, or a third time. A dead genius is just a dead person. He's no longer a genius. In that instant, everyone's eyes revealed a look of understanding. Previously, they had been wondering how Fang Xinjian had offended someone from the Knight Association. Hearing Hailong's words, they finally understood what had happened. If the enemy was the royal family, then it was not impossible for them to mobilize the Knight Association. In that instant, Fang Xinjian had already been sentenced to death in their hearts. Just as everyone was still discussing Fang Xinjian, the silver-haired Hamel, the leader of Class 248, knocked on his cup and said, All right, Fang Xinjian is just a joke. Let's not discuss such an outdated topic anymore. I have something to say. Everyone instantly quietened down. The hall, which had been extremely noisy earlier, instantly fell silent. It could be seen that Hamel's authority in Class 248 had reached such a level. Hamel smiled. His face, which looked as clean as a mountain spring, now emitted a sound that sounded like metal clashing. It was as if his entire body was made of metal. I've already reached level 12, embodiment of the gargantuan mammoth. I plan to participate in next year's regional selection. I'll leave the academy in a month's time and start searching for the last few medicinal herbs required for the specialty platinum sacred chi. Boss, you're leaving? The red-browed man cried out, but with your current abilities, there's no way for you to advance further in the academy. Other than the experienced instructors who have been in the first transition for tens of years, there's no one else who can be your match. But the instructor's talent has already reached its limit, and there's no longer any chance for you to participate in the regional selection. There's no point in you staying here. It's indeed time for you to leave. The lady in leather also smiled. Boss, with your abilities, you'll definitely succeed in next year's regional selection. We'll congratulate you in advance. Haha, that's right, boss. After you became a conferred knight, we've all benefited from it. Just as everyone was raising their cups, a loud boom rang out from the dining hall's door, as if it had been struck by a bomb. It exploded, turning into countless shards that flew towards the entire room. However, the 8 knights present were all first transition level 19 expert. How could they possibly be injured by such a small matter? In that instant, countless reduced force fields exerted their powers at the same time, and all the shards froze in midair, gradually coming to a stop and then falling down. There's no need to leave. Fang Xinjian walked in with his sword in hand. Lilia skipped behind him, looking at the scene with excitement and worry. Seeing that everyone was staring at him, Fang Xinjian nodded. Very good, everyone's here. Since you've injured someone from my class, you'll naturally have to pay it back 100-fold. All of you can stay in bed for a few months. As for the regional selection, there's even less of a need for you to participate. Chapter 106. Hearing Fang Xinjian's words, the countenances of everyone present changed. Waves of killing intent emanated from their bodies, locking onto Fang Xinjian. Class 248's leader, Hamel, wore an unfathomable smile as he looked calmly at Fang Xinjian, as if he was looking at a mischievous younger brother. The red-browed burly man, who had been extremely displeased with Fang Xinjian, was the first to stand up, saying furiously, "Fang Xinjian, can't you see where you are? Has your brain been squeezed by a door? You're asking for a beating." Fang Xinjian's voice rang out calmly in everyone's ears. The next moment, a strong gust of wind blew, and Fang Xinjian pierced through the air like a bolt of lightning, appearing before the red-browed burly man in an instant. The burly man's mouth was still open, spittle flying everywhere. Fang Xinjian gave a light pat with his palm, and then darted back to his original position at lightning speed. His movements were as fast as lightning, and the time taken was shorter than the blink of an eye. The red-browed burly man had no time to react at all. He only felt a huge force coming at his face, and his entire head was twisted to the side involuntarily. Then, waves of burning pain could be felt from his face. He felt as if half of his face had gone numb. However, at the next moment, endless fury gushed forth. His eyes were bloodshot, and with a wave of one hand, a huge metal hammer was brought over by his reduced force field. The hammer pointed at Fang Xinjian, revealing a cruel smile. "Draw your sword. You're dead meat today." Fang Xinjian said coldly, "You're not worthy of my sword." Everyone in Class 248 had already stood up, looking at Fang Xinjian as if they were looking at a lunatic, a dead man. Hearing Fang Xinjian's words, the red-browed burly man laughed maniacally and said, "Then you're the one who's courting death." After saying that, he suddenly opened his mouth. His eyebrows first emitted a crimson light, then his mouth, eyes, nose, and ears all emitted crimson-red flames. His entire body was burning like a flaming giant. Flames burst out from his feet, and the flames spread in all directions, as if they were going to burn the entire villa to ashes in the next moment. This killing technique, purgatory flames, allowed the red-browed burly man's body to emit flames with a high temperature of several hundred or even over 1,000 degrees Celsius. Just by getting close to him, he would be able to burn his opponent into a dried husk. This was also the reason why he had the confidence to challenge Fang Xinjian. However, just as the flames were about to burst forth from his body, Fang Xinjian moved. As he moved, the entire world seemed to slow down. It was not that time had slowed down, but rather that Fang Xinjian's speed had reached an extreme in that instant. Therefore, the entire world seemed to have slowed down in his eyes. Not only had Fang Xinjian's abilities not regressed after such a long period of confinement, but because of the improvement in his sword arts, the tempering of his attributes, and the improvement in his waves, his abilities had once again increased by leaps and bounds. The flames moved at an extremely slight range. Someone's eyelids had just started to blink, but their eyelids were moving at a micron by a micron, as if they could not fall no matter what. Amidst this extreme speed, Fang Xinjian had already dashed up to the red-browed burly man. The red-browed burly man still maintained his savage expression, his head covered in crimson flames. It was only then that the air currents caused by Fang Xinjian's dash slowly spread out in all directions, starting from the path he had passed by. They were as viscous as ocean waves, yet they still did not manage to collide into any obstacles. The next moment, Fang Xinjian slowly stretched out 2 fingers, gently pressing down on the red-browed burly man's eyelid. He then tapped on the burly man's throat, chest, and stomach with another finger. Following that, Fang Xinjian retreated from the extreme speed, and time seemed to have returned to normal once again. Boom! The air currents brought about by Fang Xinjian's body crashed out in all directions, and countless glass cups were instantly shattered into pieces. The red-browed burly man let out a loud bellow, his voice filled with a myriad of pain. He could only feel an intense pain in his eyes, his throat was hoarse, his chest felt stuffy, and his stomach was in so much pain that it was as if his intestines had been broken. He covered his eyes, howling in agony as he knelt down. Fang Xinjian. B*****. Among the people who saw this scene, there were immediately people who wanted to take action to restrain Fang Xinjian. Their reduced force fields were activated in unison, encompassing Fang Xinjian. However, with an explosive rumble, the place where Fang Xinjian had been standing was now empty, leaving behind only a strong swirling air current. Under the pressure of several reduced force fields, loud rumbling sounds rang out. Bang bang bang! During the period of time when Fang Xinjian had disappeared, another 3 soft sounds rang out. 3 knights were flicked on their foreheads one after another, fainting from a concussion. Everyone looked at Fang Xinjian in disbelief, as if they were looking at a demon or ghost. Hailong, who had been slandering Fang Xinjian earlier, felt the muscles all over his body trembling violently, and large beads of perspiration kept appearing on his forehead. Even Hamel, who had been the calmest, finally stood up, staring at Fang Xinjian like an eagle. The entire villa was silent. Only Lilia, who had been following behind Fang Xinjian, laughed out loud and shouted provocatively, "Do you guys understand now? My master is the most amazing. Weren't you guys very amazing during the competition? Be even more amazing." Fang Xinjian stood there without a care in the world. He gently flicked his fingers. His fingers, which were clearly as white as jade and had the skin of a baby, emitted the sound of metal clashing, as if metals were colliding. This was because his attributes had reached a level that far surpassed that of ordinary humans. His flesh, bones, and tendons were all extremely condensed and sturdy, like steel bars. Following that, Fang Xinjian threw a glance at Hamel and said, In Class 248, you're the only one who uses a sword, right? Looking at Fang Xinjian's earlier attack, silver-haired Hamel's brows furrowed. This Fang Xinjian is really a monster. How much time has passed? To think that he has become so much stronger than he was during the competition? If Hamel were to know that just in terms of tempering attributes, Fang Xinjian's speed was 10 times that of others, and that his 10 overdays of training was equivalent to that of an ordinary person's training for 3 months, who knew what he would think? Moreover, his sword arts training and waves training had all improved at a faster rate. In summary, their 10 overdays of training was equivalent to that of an ordinary person's training for several years. If Hamel were to know of this, he would probably be so astonished that his eyeballs would pop out. However, even if he did not know of this, it did not prevent him from understanding one thing. If he were to fight against Fang Xinjian now, he no longer had the confidence to win. He said, "Fang Xinjian, fighting is forbidden in the academy. I'll report this to the headmaster. As for why you're looking for me now, I'm not interested in knowing." Fang Xinjian looked at his fingers and said, "Then let's fight first." Before he finished his words, Fang Xinjian put his finger together like a sword and tapped out. Countless strong gales swept out from his fingertips, and when the tip of his finger reached its end, the countless strong gales turned into a myriad of sword cheese, gushing out toward Hamel. Before Hamel could react, he was already encompassed by the myriad of sword cheese. However, it had been 8 years since Hamel had transitioned into a knight, and his 5 attributes had all been trained to 85 points and above. If Fang Xinjian did not activate his specialties and killing techniques, his speed would only be slightly higher than Hamel's. If Fang Xinjian were to attack someone else, Hamel would not be able to stop him in time. However, if Fang Xinjian were to attack him, he would be able to react in time. Silver light exploded in the sky, and an extremely huge figure swelled up, shattering the sword cheese and stirring up the air currents. "Fang Xinjian, you asked for this. Have a taste of the prowess of my level 12 embodiment of the gargantuan mammoth, and then live in fear and respect for this power forever." Chapter 107. The killing technique that Hamel cultivated, embodiment of the colossal mammoth, was a killing technique that mimicked a level 27 ferocious beast, the mammoth colossal mammoth. After activating the embodiment of the colossal mammoth, the muscles and bones throughout his body trembled rapidly, and under the reinforcement from the ether particles, they continued to multiply and swell. In an instant, he turned into a small giant with a height of over 5 meters, covered in silver skin. With a loud boom, a large hole was smashed open in the ceiling of the dining room by his abruptly growing body. With a casual sweep of Hamel's hand, he lifted the entire ceiling. Amidst countless exclamations, the villa's second level was revealed. However, at this moment, no one was concerned about the villa. All the knights from Class 248 retreated rapidly, looking at the transformed Hamel in fear. Fang Xinjian also revealed a surprised expression as he gently drew out the longsword at his waist. Hamel laughed. "It's useless, Fang Xinjian. The level 12 embodiment of the colossal mammoth not only bestows me with a defense that is as strong as a steel wall, but it also increases my strength, agility, and physical strength by a few times." Amidst his maniacal laughter, he punched out slightly. Booming sounds of explosions rang out continuously in the air, and waves of ripples that could be seen by the naked eye extended out in all directions from his palm, smashing into the walls and creating many small pits. "Haha, supersonic speed? Is it of any use?" Boom! Hamel's body drew out a long stream of white air, and he came crashing over like a city wall. An overwhelming reduced force field came gushing over, as if a mountain was pressing down on top of Fang Xinjian's head. In that instant, his explosive speed had already reached the level of subsonic speed. Fang Xinjian only had time to draw out the longsword at his waist, and with a soft bang, he was sent flying. Hamel let out a wild bellow and followed after them. Bang 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 bang! Amidst the chaotic sounds, the entire villa suddenly collapsed. Everyone quickly rushed out and saw that on the lawn outside the villa, two figures, one big and one small, were intersecting, flashing, and colliding with each other like lightning. Another muffled bang rang out, and the two figures paused for a moment. Streams of air currents shot out from the spot where they had clashed. Hamel stood there like a mountain, unmoving, while Fang Xinjian was sent flying for over 10 meters before he gradually came to a stop. He looked at his right hand. His entire arm was bent unnaturally. His shoulder was dislocated. Without changing his expression, he used his other hand to move his shoulder and restore the dislocation. On the other side, Hamel's lips curled up into a savage smile. It was unknown when, but a huge sword that looked like a metal club had appeared in his hand. The sword did not even have a blade, and it seemed as if it was solely relying on its weight to smash its opponent. Hamel said, "Fang Xinjian, if you had come looking for me a few years later, I might have been a little more serious. But you're too arrogant. To think that you want to challenge me, the strongest in the academy, in just 1 month's time. You're really overestimating yourself. Do you really think that you're invincible at supersonic speed during the first transition? People are only astonished by your age and the amount of time you've spent cultivating, but not by your abilities." Fang Xinjian shook the longsword in his hand. It had been completely shattered, and he threw it away. He waved his hand in Lilia's direction, and the latter tossed him an ordinary metal sword. Throughout the entire process, Hamel did not stop him. He only looked coldly at Fang Xinjian, as if he was looking at a lamb waiting to be slaughtered. Fang Xinjian swung his longsword, looked at Hamel and said, "You're not bad." He smiled. "There are so many people here, but you're the only one who is worthy of receiving a few of my sword attacks." Arrogant. Hamel let out a cold laugh, and with a long whizzing sound, he dashed towards Fang Xinjian like a train. However, this time around, Fang Xinjian, who was still surrounded by countless strong gales and sword cheese, managed to dodge each of his attacks by a hair's breadth. Each time Hamel slashed out, it was as if the mountains and rivers were overturned, and the air gushed forth as if the heavens were collapsing and the earth was sinking. However, no matter how strong the gales were and how the sword cheese moved about, they were still unable to get within 3 inches of Fang Xinjian. This guy. What's wrong with him? In Fang Xinjian's eyes, the unparalleled sword intent was fully activated. Right now, in his eyes, Hamel was filled with flaws. Each time he circulated his sword technique, each second of his vital energy and blood surged, they were all filled with loopholes and flaws in Fang Xinjian's eyes. With a series of quick attacks, both of their movements were extremely fast. In the blink of an eye, several hundred moves had been exchanged, and Hamel felt increasingly astonished. It was because he had yet to even touch Fang Xinjian. Be it his sword moves, his footwork, or even his intentions, they seemed to have all been seen through by Fang Xinjian. Fang Xinjian, on the other hand, became increasingly faster under the continuous acceleration of the supreme Mistwind sword. In the next instant, Boundary's negation was activated. Too weak. Fang Xinjian's words rang out in his ears, and Hamel cried out in his heart, "What?" At the same time, it was as if a myriad of thunderbolts were ringing out in midair. It was a scene of countless sword lights intersecting with each other. Countless streams of sword cheese exploded with the two of them at the center. Amidst a myriad of thunderous booms, several layers of the ground were slashed open by the sword cheese. Eventually, they dissipated, revealing Fang Xinjian and Hamel. Soft pft sounds rang out one after another, and countless bloodlines shot out from Hamel's body one after another. He felt an intense pain in his knees, and he was already half kneeling on the ground. His massive body, which was over 5 meters tall, half knelt on the ground, creating a series of muffled rumbling sounds. How is this possible? He saw through the flaws in my physique of the gargantuan mammoth in an instant, and then broke through them one by one? And how is it that his speed is so much faster than mine? The physique of the gargantuan mammoth stimulated vital energy and blood within a short period of time, changing the human body's structure, strengthening the stratum corneum of the human body, and covering a large portion of the skin on the body. However, there was clearly a difference in the strength of this enhancement. Many of Hamel's joints and hidden areas of his muscles were critical points where vital energy and blood flowed. They were also important joints that his muscles and stratum corneum were unable to cover. These areas were the weaknesses of his impenetrable body. However, they had been easily broken through by Feng Xinjian. It should be known that he did not tell anyone about these weaknesses. How could he not be astonished, and dismayed by something like this? Feng Xinjian shook the long sword in his hand, and the blade shattered inch by inch, turning into a myriad of fragments that scattered into the air. Feng Xinjian shook his head at Hamel. Although you use the sword, your sword art's cultivation is not worth mentioning at all. In the process of exchanging blows with Hamel earlier, he had not learned any sword techniques at all. It was because he realized that Hamel was fighting purely with the attributes of the physique of the gargantuan mammoth, and the sword techniques he used were all basic sword techniques that could be found in the academy. Although Hamel had reached the maximum level in these sword techniques, they were of no use to Feng Xinjian. This Hamel had clearly spent all his time on other cultivation, focusing on his attribute. He had not put in the effort to cultivate his sword arts at all. He's really too weak. He shook his head again, not forgetting to wave his hand and say, "Let's go, Lilia." Lilia made a funny face at the people from Class 248, then chased after Feng Xinjian. Hailong fell to the ground and could not help but shout, "Feng Xinjian, remember this. This matter." Feng Xinjian, who had been walking earlier, turned his head and looked at the enraged faces of the people from Class 248. Looking at their panicked, fearful, yet furious and vengeful gazes, he said calmly, "Don't let me hear your nonsense. I'll slash at whoever says another word." Feng Xinjian's gaze, which was as sharp as sword light, swept across everyone's bodies, and everyone felt a chill rising from the bottom of their hearts. It was only then that the scene of Feng Xinjian knocking out 4 of his companions, then beating up Hamel to the point where he could not stand up, as well as his demonic voice, rang out in their minds. Hailong was like a duck that had its neck choked. The words that he had wanted to say earlier were swallowed back into his stomach. It was only when Feng Xinjian and Feng Xinjian's silhouettes completely disappeared that he bellowed furiously. "This matter mustn't end just like this. He's practically shitting on our heads. If this matter were to end just like this, how are we supposed to go out and face others? We'll become the laughingstock of the entire academy." Hamel stared at his hands in a daze, as if unable to believe that he had been defeated just like that. How is this possible? In just 1.5 months, he surpassed me, who had transitioned 8 years ago? How can there be someone in this world who possesses such monstrous talent? At the next moment, the internal injuries in his body flared up, and he spat out a large mouthful of blood and fainted onto the ground. This caused everyone to be at a loss of what to do. However, a few seconds later, Feng Xinjian returned and said, "I've forgotten. I said that I would send all of you to lie in bed for a few months, right?" With a rumble, Feng Xinjian dashed out and sword light filled the sky. Hailong was sent flying with blood spurting out of his mouth. The other knights who were still standing also fell to the ground one by one. Various sounds of bone fractures and agonizing cries rang out incessantly. They could only watch as Feng Xinjian slowly walked away, disappearing into the darkness. Hailong looked at Feng Xinjian's departing back with a face filled with hatred. Although his injuries were serious, he had the specialty high-speed regeneration. His injuries were recovering at a speed that could be seen by the naked eye, and a few minutes later, He was already able to stand up unsteadily. Chapter 108. Lilia followed behind Feng Xinjian agitatedly, carrying a large basket of metal swords on her back. She said, "Teacher, you're so amazing. This is so satisfying," she said as she looked at Feng Xinjian with stars in her eyes. "Where are we going next?" Feng Xinjian threw a glance at his stats window. In the process of the battle earlier, his Ice Age meditation art had improved once again, finally breaking through a barrier and reaching level 3. Right now, he only felt that his entire brain was cool, and all his thoughts and consciousness were extremely clean and clear. It was as if even the speed at which he considered problems had increased by a lot, and the memories of the many things that had happened in the past were now many times clearer. He could even remember the details of what he ate and drank for the past 10 or so days clearly. Such a satisfying battle had allowed his Ice Age meditation art to improve even more rapidly. As expected, the act of defeating his opponents single-handedly allowed Feng Xinjian to express his feelings, venting the frustrations he had accumulated over the past few days of investigations. Hearing Lilia's question, Feng Xinjian said calmly, "Go look for Class 249. Since he had already done it, and since he would have to face the Academy's punishment anyway, Feng Xinjian decided to make good use of his time and pick all the students he could. Not only could he secretly learn sword techniques, but he could also increase the familiarity of his Ice Age meditation art. Thinking of how he could single-handedly defeat so many experts in the Academy, he felt that the circulation of his mental cultivation method seemed to be a little faster, and he felt a sense of exhilaration. When I, Feng Xinjian, do things, there are no taboos, as long as my heart is at peace. A cold gleam flashed in Feng Xinjian's eyes as he carried Lilia and dashed out. Class 249 was the class whose cultivation time was second only to Class 248. Currently, there were also 8 students in the academy. The prefectural champion was an aristocrat by the name of Ralph, and he was also a swordsman. There were many knights in the empire, and there were countless types of martial technique. However, in terms of the 5 main categories of swords and sabers, staffs and staffs, bows and crossbows, barehanded and miscellaneous, swords and sabers were naturally the most powerful, taking up about half of all the knight cultivators. Swords and sabers had always been the king of the empire's martial techniques. However, Class 249 was not gathered together like Class 248. Therefore, Feng Xinjian dashed straight to the villa of the prefectural champion, Ralph. At this moment, Ralph was practicing his sword techniques in the training room. His upper body was bare and he was sweating profusely. Every move he executed, even if it was extremely slow, would cause terrifying vibrations in the air. This was the sound of his muscles and bones trembling crazily, causing the air to tremble and form weak shock waves. Just then, his body suddenly paused, his longsword slanted and his reduced force field appeared before him like a force field shield. The next moment, amidst a loud explosion, countless cyclones directly smashed through the outer walls of the villa, sweeping through every room in the villa unscrupulously like a typhoon. In midair, Feng Xinjian held onto Lilia's neck like he was holding onto a puppy. Sword cheese surrounded his entire body as he slowly descended before Ralph. Feng Xinjian. Ralph frowned and asked, "What do you mean by this?" Every prefectural champion was the cream of the crop in the entire cursed area. All of them were extremely talented people. Moreover, Ralph had spent a total of 7 years cultivating in the academy. Regardless of whether it was his attributes, level, waves, or killing techniques, they were all in the best condition. His true goal had always been to defeat Hamel and then participate in the regional selection. Only those senior instructors in the academy who had gone through the first transition for decades, or old monsters from great clans like Rebecca, who had gone through the first transition, would be able to win against him. In fact, if not for the fact that his team members were slightly weaker than Hamel's, their class would definitely be able to defeat Hamel's class. Therefore, even though he knew that Fang Xinjian had surpassed the speed of sound and was a genius who had displayed outstanding battle prowess in the competition, Ralph still had great confidence. It was because as long as his opponent was a knight who had gone through the first transition, no matter who it was, he had the confidence to defeat them with his sword. If he did not even have this bit of confidence, then what was the point of being a knight? What was the point of being a prefectural champion? It was just like the middle school and high school students on Earth. Even if they had nothing and were ranked at the bottom of the entire grade, they would still have the confidence to trample over the richest man in the world and beat up the president. They would not feel that they were inferior to anyone else. This was the drive of youngsters, let alone a prefectural champion like Ralph. Hearing Ralph's question, Fang Xinjian first let go of Lilia, who was in his hands. Then, with a flick of his index finger, a long sword jumped out from the basket on Lilia's back and landed in his hand. Receive a sword attack from me first. Get your spirits up. Don't be unable to even receive a single sword attack from me. After saying this, Fang Xinjian slashed down from afar. A vortex with a width of 4 to 5 meters suddenly formed, and then in the blink of an eye, it turned into a huge tornado of sword chi sweeping toward Ralph. What? Dick's eyes were wide open as he said in disbelief. Fang Xinjian tore down Hamel's villa, injured Hamel and the people from Class 248, and then knocked Class 249's Ralph unconscious? That's right. Class 248's Hailong shouted, "Teacher, quickly take care of this Fang Xinjian from your class. He's going to look for the people from Class 250 again. He's going to turn the entire academy upside down. This is too unreasonable, too overbearing, and it's like a bandit's actions. What right does he have to beat people up like this in the academy, disregarding the academy's rules? What right does he have?" Dick thought of the governor, the headmaster, and Charlie, who had been slapped in the face but had not dared to say a single word, leaving dejectedly. He laughed bitterly and said, let's go. We'll go take a look at the situation first." Hailong did not notice the change in Dick's tone. He only nodded fiercely and said, "Teacher, this kind of undisciplined and disorganized student who brazenly goes against the academy's rules must definitely be severely punished." Punishment? Dick let out a cold laugh and threw a glance at Hailong, as if he was looking at an idiot. He had wanted to remind him of something, but after giving it some thought, he still shook his head. The two of them quickly headed for Class 250's prefectural champion's villa. Along the way, they saw many workers, servants, and students walking out. Some of their faces were filled with panic, while others were filled with curiosity and astonishment. "Have you heard?" Fang Xinjian single-handedly challenged Hamel and Ralph. "Damn, this Fang Xinjian is too arrogant. Not only is he arrogant, he's also too strong. To be able to win against Hamel and Ralph, doesn't that mean that his 1.5 months of cultivation is equivalent to our several years of cultivation? Wasn't he captured by the Association for Investigation? Why is he out again?" The more Hailong heard, the more infuriated he became, while the more Dick heard, the calmer he became. From his previous hostility towards Fang Xinjian to his current indifference, he now understood very well how valuable Fang Xinjian was. It could be said that Fang Xinjian was now the headmaster's and Huang Lin's treasure, and even important people like the governor regarded him with great importance. The greater the trouble he caused, the more people he defeated, and the stronger he was, the more he would display his talent and potential. Not only would he not be punished severely, but he would also be valued even more. Of course, there might also be some punishments for the ordinary student. Dick had already seen through this point very clearly. When he followed the crowd to Class 250's prefectural champion's villa, he could only see large areas of ruins, countless cracks in the ground, collapsed houses, shattered grass, and over 10 longswords stabbed into the ground. "Look, that's Class 250's Jeravi. Damn it, she lost too. Dick followed the crowd's gaze and saw a brown-haired beauty dressed in crimson armor kneeling on the ground. There was a large pool of blood under her feet, and streams of fresh blood were flowing down her face, neck, and stomach. However, they were all superficial wounds and were not fatal. With the attributes of a knight, she would be able to recover within a few days. But at least for now, she no longer had the strength to continue fighting. Just then, another world-shaking explosion rang out from the academy in the distance. Then streams of piercing light shot up into the sky. Almost all the knights could sense that the ether particles in the distance had suddenly become extremely agitated. It's Class 251's prefectural champion, Rhoda's villa. Have they started fighting again? Quick, let's go take a look. Dick looked at the streams of light shooting up into the sky and smiled bitterly, shaking his head. Hailong said anxiously, "Teacher, let's go over quickly. Otherwise, there will be even more people getting injured." Fang Xinjian, that damned thing, doesn't he know the rules at all? Can't he be reasonable? Chapter 109. A few minutes before Fang Xinjian took action, the prefectural champion of Class 251, a class 5 years earlier than Fang Xinjian and the others, Rhoda, sat quietly in the hall of her villa. The one sitting at the head of the table was naturally the prefectural champion of Class 251, Rhoda, who had transitioned into the Spear of Death. She was also one of the top 3 in the Knight Academy, second only to Hamel of Class 248 and Ralph of Class 249. She was a beautiful lady with long black hair that cascaded down like a waterfall and eyes as blue as the sea. Her skin was snow-white, and her legs were slender and long. Her every movement exuded a mysterious charm. She was the prefectural champion of Class 251, Rhoda. She was both a prefectural champion and an aristocrat, which allowed her to spend a large amount of resources on maintaining her body every day. Long periods of training had made her limbs slender and strong, giving her a sexy figure. Countless medicinal cuisine essences had made her skin extremely exquisite, silky smooth like milk. Every move she made exuded an astonishing sexiness and charm. The 3 people in front of Rhoda were the 3 who had been defeated by Fang Xinjian. From Class 252, Renault, who possessed supersonic archery, and Tresia's Xiao-Yi. From Class 253, Claude, who had grown up in the Netherworld Valley but was not proficient in poison arts, had transitioned into the Whirlwind of Death. Other than Rhoda, almost everyone else present was a knight who had been defeated by Fang Xinjian. Although Xiao-Yi had not been truly defeated, and even had the confidence to defeat Fang Xinjian with the Ring of Lightning, there was no doubt that in everyone's eyes, he had been defeated by Fang Xinjian. This was what made him even more displeased. Moreover, the Ring of Lightning had already been taken back by Rebecca. Seeing that everyone was silent and sitting there quietly, Claude, who had the biggest physique, squeezed his butt, causing the chair he was sitting on to creak. After a few minutes, seeing that no one was speaking, he clenched his fists impatiently, finally being the first to break the silence. "Rhoda, you're very beautiful, but I don't have the habit of fighting 3 against 1. If you have nothing else to say, then I'll be leaving." A hint of fury flashed in Rhoda's eyes as she said coldly, "Your mouth is getting more and more smelly, Claude. Of course, I have my reasons for looking for you today. All 3 of you were defeated by Fang Xinjian, right?" Rhoda said slowly. "Don't you want to win it back? Or are you going to act as if nothing has happened and let people look down on you and point fingers at you behind your back?" Fang Xinjian had defeated students who were of a higher grade than him, and thus received countless praises and adoration. On the other hand, the senior students who had been defeated by him were seen as incompetent by many people, and thus received many malicious comments. Claude and the other 2 were all geniuses of their own world. How arrogant were they? How could they be willing to accept this? However, when Fang Xinjian displayed his swordsmanship that surpassed the speed of sound, it completely destroyed their hopes of getting lucky. Even Xiao Yi, who was the most confident among the three of them, knew that if he did not rely on the Ring of Lightning, it would be impossible for him to defeat Fang Xinjian. Hearing Rhoda's words, Renaud put on a fake smile and said, Fang Xinjian has transitioned into a windstorm sword hero, and he has already surpassed the speed of sound even though he has not completed the first transition. How fast will he be when he has completed the first transition a few years later? Of course I want to defeat him, to trample him under my feet, Renaud said fiercely. I wanted to see him kneel on the ground and beg for mercy, begging me to forgive him, but forget about it. I know my own talent, and it will be very difficult for me to catch up to him in this life. Saying this, he laughed coldly. Moreover, Fang Xinjian has been captured by the Association for Investigation. He's already crippled, and he has offended the royal family. He can't even fend for himself, so why should I go against a dead man? Haha, Renaud, if you really think that Fang Xinjian will fall just like that, then I can only say that you're too childish. I've really overestimated you. Seeing the fury on Renaud's face, Rhoda was very clear about this. A 16-year-old windstorm sword hero, a 16-year-old warrior who transcends the speed of sound. How can those important people give up on him so easily? Moreover, I have someone in the ward who has just received news that he has already woken up. Therefore, I dare to say that not only will Fang Xinjian be fine after being taken away by the association, he will even be released in one piece. By then, there will probably be no one in Cursed who will be able to control him. Renaud remained silent. Xiao Yi frowned and said, Then what are you trying to say? If Fang Xinjian is really released, then it's even more impossible for us to touch him. If such a genius were to be harmed, the Knight Association will definitely get to the bottom of this. Who said anything about harming him? Rhoda smiled and said, Don't you guys understand? As long as Fang Xinjian is in this academy, he will naturally be a threat to our position. But at the same time, isn't it also a form of pressure? You guys have been living too comfortably. Now that you have such a strong opponent, why don't you use him to motivate yourselves and achieve new breakthroughs that surpass your own limits? Claude said impatiently, What on earth do you mean? Rhoda said, Originally, every class was a competitor, but now that Fang Xinjian has appeared, the pressure he brings is enough for all of us to join forces. Claude scratched his chin and said, You mean that we should gang up on him? Idiot. Rhoda scolded. What I mean is that we can form an alliance, exchange resources, exchange martial arts experiences, and improve together. She looked at Claude and said, Claude, you're able to buy all of the secret medicines in the Netherworld Valley cheaply, right? I know that the Netherworld Valley has quite a number of secret medicines that are only provided to internal members. Not only can they increase one's potential, but they can also stimulate one's vital energy and blood, allowing the body to go through a second phase of development, increasing one's attributes once again. And you, Xiao Yi, the body-tempering ointment in your Treasure Academy has always been priceless. Also, I know that even if one is not proficient in sword arts, many of the secret nurturing techniques can also be used to train one's organs and circulate one's vital energy and blood. Renaud, your clan has been secretly dealing in weapons and equipment, right? You even have connections to overseas black markets to buy, sell, and even forge remains divine weapons. Rhoda looked at the three knights and said, It's because of the external pressure from Fang Xinjian that we've been able to join forces. Or are you guys willing to be thrashed by him in the interclass competition every month, losing all face among the students? As long as we can consume more medicine, have more ferocious beasts, and even have remains divine weapons, with 10 of us in a class, how can we not be able to defeat Fang Xinjian alone? Renaud smiled coldly and said, It's easy to say. How many interests are involved in this? Do all the elders in your clan agree? And what about Hamel and Ralph? They have even more good stuff. Why don't you get them to bring it out? Those two idiots are too arrogant, Rhoda said. People like them won't think that they are inferior to Fang Xinjian unless they are defeated by him. Therefore, I didn't invite them at all. When they are defeated by Fang Xinjian next month, we'll join forces with them. As for the opinions of our clans, how can they be more important than the improvement of our own abilities? Fang Xinjian is a threat, but he is also an opportunity. Therefore, it will be easier for us to get more things from our clans. As long as we join forces, we'll have several times the resources we had previously. Our attributes, waves, killing techniques, weapons, and armors will all improve by leaps and bounds. And Fang Xinjian is alone, with only the Academy supporting him. I heard that the Empire's divine weapons he applied for were all rejected. Therefore, as long as we join forces and help each other, we might be able to attain a breakthrough under the pressure, or even defeat him. The greater the pressure, the greater the rebound. All of you want to advance to become conferred knights, right? If you don't seek a breakthrough under the heavy pressure from Fang Xinjian, the chances of you advancing will be even slimmer. After saying that, Rhoda assessed the three of them. Seeing how they seemed to be tempted, the corners of her lips curled up into a smile. She had a calm and confident look on her face, making her look even more charming. The four of them then started discussing the details of the exchange of resources and experiences. Over 10 minutes later, strong gales blew past and the door to the villa was knocked open with a bang. Fang Xinjian walked in with Lilia in his hand. Looking at the four of them, he smiled and said, "Not bad, not bad. All four of you are here. This saves me the trouble of looking for you one by one." He looked at the experience points of his Ice Age meditation art, which had increased by about 10% after he had defeated 2 people consecutively. He said calmly, "Come at me together. The instructors are still chasing after me. I can only keep you guys here for half a minute at most." After defeating so many experts in the academy in a row, Fang Xinjian's aura grew increasingly stronger, and the circulation speed of his mental cultivation method also grew increasingly faster. He felt that the gloominess in his heart had been swept away. This was the first time in his life that he had been able to move about freely and without any restraints. Chapter 110. Fang Xinjian, what do you mean by this? Rhoda asked, puzzled. I have no feud with you, so I don't understand why you're looking for me. Moreover, the Academy forbids private fight. Are you going against the rules knowingly? Fang Xinjian flicked the longsword in his hand gently and said, I've made some achievements in my sword arts, so of course, I need to find someone to test my sword skills on. I'm not afraid to tell you that I've just defeated Hamel, Ralph, and the others before coming here to look for you. I didn't expect that all 4 of you would be here. You've really saved me a lot of effort. Moreover, if I don't defeat all of you today, I won't be able to rest easy. After saying this, Fang Xinjian felt exhilarated. As his thoughts circulated, his mental cultivation method improved even further. Hearing Fang Xinjian's words that were like sharp swords, Rhoda's countenance changed. Her pupils contracted as she said coldly, Fang Xinjian, you're going against the rules knowingly. You're not showing any respect for the Academy's rules, the headmaster, or the Knight Association. Are you thinking of rebelling? Fang Xinjian shook his head and said calmly, Don't talk about rules with me. If everything in this world can be done with rules, then I wouldn't have come here to learn sword arts. The reason why I'm learning sword arts is so that I can ignore rules. Therefore, I, Fang Xinjian, do things without any restrictions. Arrogant. Renault's gaze was extremely vicious. He looked at Fang Xinjian as if he was looking at an idiot. All 4 of us are here today. Could it be that you're thinking of dealing with the 4 of us single-handedly? Claude smiled as well. Fang Xinjian, you must have damaged your brain after being unconscious for a few days, right? Do you know what you're saying? Fang Xinjian, do you really think that you can win against the 4 of us single-handedly? Rhoda still wanted to say something, but Fang Xinjian let out a cold snort and charged out with his sword in hand. Streams of sword cheese bloomed like 100 flowers, turning into countless sword cheese tornadoes that swept out toward the four of them. Cut the crap. If you can take a few of my sword strikes, then we'll talk. The four people present were all top-notch experts amongst the first transition knights, and their reaction speed far surpassed that of ordinary knight. However, this sudden outburst from Fang Xinjian's supreme Mistwind sword was still like a raging tempest, with countless sword cheese slashing down like rain. The four of them let out furious bellows, resisting the sword cheese together. However, they felt as if the streams of sword cheese were omnipresent, wanting to pierce through every single gap and break through their defenses. F***CK. Claude shouted loudly. Green chi circulated all over his body. He had already activated the profound golden armor. The pair of short axes in his hands danced in a dazzling manner, splitting the surrounding sword chi into pieces. However, his heart was filled with fear. How could this Fang Xinjian improve so quickly? After not seeing him for half a month, the speed and prowess of his sword cheese have become even stronger. The other three also had the same feeling. Amidst the densely packed sword cheese, there was an extremely condensed and compressed air everywhere, forming sword cheese tornadoes that surrounded them. It was as if over 100 knights had surrounded and attacked them in that instant, making it impossible for them to even touch Fang Xinjian's real body. The four of them knew that this was not the time for them to hide their abilities. In an instant, they all unleashed their respective killing technique. Xiao Yi was the first to do so. Within his reduced force field, countless force field shields suddenly appeared. It was like a huge air shield, pushing back the surrounding sword cheese fiercely. Not only did it protect him, but it also protected the other three as well. Then it was Claude's turn. The muscles on his arms swelled up like balloons, and then, like springs that had been compressed to their limits, piercing sounds of the air being pierced through rang out. His two flying axes shot out like two bolts of lightning. Wherever they passed by, all the sword cheese were shattered by his two axes, clearing up a large area in an instant. Renaud then let out a soft bellow and drew his bow to a full crescent. With a crisp bang, the 5 homing arrows let out a series of sharp whistles, tearing through the atmosphere and chasing after Fang Xinjian's silhouette. On the other side, a small silver spear had unknowingly appeared in Rhoda's hands. Just as the sword cheese were shattered by Claude and Fang Xinjian's figure was exposed, the small silver spear in her hands instantly started spinning like a high-speed drill. Simultaneously, her body spun, bringing with it a graceful posture. The small silver spear cut across the sky like a bolt of lightning, and the sound of the spear disappeared into void space in the next moment. At the same time that the spear disappeared, silver light suddenly appeared behind Fang Xinjian's back. The rapidly spinning spearhead brought along a series of spiraling air currents as it suddenly appeared and pierced fiercely toward Fang Xinjian's back. It was Rhoda's killing technique, the Void Penetrative Divine Spear. It was a powerful secret technique that allowed one to attack directly through the gaps in space, regardless of distance. Although this Void Penetrative Divine Spear did not have any extraordinary powers attached to it, each spear attack was very elusive and hard to detect. Moreover, although the spear only had the power of Rhoda's flesh and blood, the power of this spear attack had gathered the trembling power of all the muscles throughout Rhoda's body. It also had the leverage of the small silver spear, as well as the twisting and spiraling piercing force. Wherever the small silver spear passed by, even the air seemed to be pierced through. The tip of the spear even brought along a cone-shaped shock wave. With this spear attack, Rhoda would be able to pierce through even the armor plate of a tank on Earth, let alone Fang Xinjian's body of flesh and blood. From the front, there were homing arrows coming from all directions, while from the back, the Void Penetrative Divine Spear pierced toward Fang Xinjian's back along with all of Rhoda's strength. Faced with such an attack, even Hamel, who had previously been the strongest in the academy, could only choose to take it head-on and suffer from internal injuries. And with Fang Xinjian's defense and physique, if he were to take it head-on, he would suffer from serious injuries. Therefore, at this critical moment, Fang Xinjian finally once again displayed his terrifying abilities, which allowed him to dominate First Transition Night. The reduced force field was like tiny ripples, accurately encompassing the 5 homing arrows and the small silver spear. To begin with, Fang Xinjian's strength was not comparable to theirs, and at this moment, the reduced force field was unable to fend off their attacks. However, no matter how weak it was, it had at least slowed down the attacks of the arrows and spear. With this delay of less than 0.1 seconds, Fang Xinjian had already twisted his body. Sword cheese spurted out and he stuck close to the tip of the small silver spear, avoiding the opponent's attack. At the same time, the long sword in his hand flashed continuously, and the 5 homing arrows shattered at the same time. There was no way to tell which one was in front and which one was behind. However, Taro and Renault's attacks did not stop there. Just as Fang Xinjian broke through their first round of attacks, another 5 homing arrows were shot out, and Taro once again sent out a spear that appeared and disappeared mysteriously. The tip of the spear drilled out from an inch away from Fang Xinjian's skin, but Fang Xinjian, who was moving at an extreme speed, managed to dodge it. Ding ding dang dang, swoosh 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 swoosh. The sounds of arrows being shattered rang out continuously, surrounding an inch around Fang Xinjian's body. Densely packed spear shadows appeared, chasing after Fang Xinjian like maggots attached to bones. Claude continued to wave his axes, continuously shattering Fang Xinjian's sword cheese. Xiao Yi remained still, enveloping the 4 of them with a force field shield, ready to defend against Fang Xinjian's lightning-fast attacks at any moment. With the 4 of them joining forces, it seemed as though they had completely suppressed Fang Xinjian, and even had the possibility of winning. It was also at this moment that more and more instructors and students finally arrived at the scene. Looking at the battlefield that was like a typhoon passing by, hints of astonishment flashed in their eyes. However, looking at Fang Xinjian, who was gradually being suppressed, they were even more astonished. Haha, this Fang Xinjian went for wool and came home shorn. Did he not expect that he would encounter 3 prefectural champions at the same time? 3 prefectural champions, 1 in second place, a total of 4 powerful knights. Fang Xinjian's loss is not undeserved. An instructor shouted, "All of you, stop! Have you all forgotten that the academy forbids private fights?" However, Taro and the other 3 had already gone all out and were unwilling to stop. Instead, they increased their strength, wanting to quickly subdue Fang Xinjian. However, at this moment, an intense sonic boom rang out in the air. Fang Xinjian's speed suddenly increased by another level. He activated Boundaries Negation and immediately broke free from the attacks of the Homing Arrow and the Void Penetrative Divine Spear. With a wave of his long sword, Fang Xinjian's body was once again encompassed by sword cheese. He said coldly, "You guys better be careful from now on. Don't get killed by my sword and waste all your years of hard work." Everyone was stunned. The long sword in Fang Xinjian's hand flashed continuously at supersonic speed, and streams of high-speed sword cheese were slashed out. It was as if thousands or even hundreds of atmospheric dragons had been born in an instant, attacking the 4 of them from all sides. This time around, the moment they came into contact with the sword cheese, everyone felt that something was wrong. It was because almost every stream of sword cheese was attacking the flaws in their move. Roar, 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 roar. The atmosphere was wreaking havoc and the swords and sabers were groaning. Rhoda and the other 3 instantly gained the upper hand, and the situation took a turn for the worse. They were now in a state where they were running for their lives and focusing all their attention on defense. It was because they were no longer able to not defend. If they did not defend, their bodies would be torn apart by the sword cheese. They could sense that each stream of sword cheese was attacking the weak points of their moves, as well as the crucial points where their forces were changing. Xiao Yi's force field shield was continuously being slashed at its weakest point. Within a few seconds it was like a sieve. Claude's flying axes were encompassed by over 10 streams of sword cheese. No matter how hard they struggled, they were unable to return to his hands. Having lost the protection of the other two, Renaud and Rhoda were exposed to Fang Xinjian's attack range. The two of them continued to fend off, dodge and move about. However, they realized that Fang Xinjian's sword cheese were like many strands of spider silk, attacking from all directions. Each stream of sword cheese was aimed at the places where they had to save themselves. Within a short period of time, they had been forced to have less and less space to dodge. In fact, as Fang Xinjian got increasingly used to their moves, there were many times when there would already be sword cheese waiting for them at the flaws of their moves when they had only performed half a move. Finally, 3 consecutive bangs rang out, and Taro's small silver spear, Renaud's sacred bow, and Xiao Yi's longsword were all struck down. They were then sent flying to Fang Xinjian's side by the sword cheese. Fang Xinjian shook his head. That's all there is to it. The countenances of the 4 of them turned extremely pale in that instant, as if they could not believe what had just happened. At the next moment, endless fury surged up in their hearts. The 4 of them had been defeated despite having joined forces. This was an unprecedented humiliation. Chapter 111. Endless fury welled up in the hearts of the 4 of them. However, at the next moment Claude, Renaud, and Xiao Yi all felt dejected. So what if they were furious? So what if they were jealous? The difference in their abilities was right before their eyes. No matter how much they threw a tantrum, they would not be able to change the truth. What made them feel even more despair was the talent Fang Xinjian had displayed. How long had it been? Fang Xinjian's abilities had once again improved at such an astonishing rate. They even felt that even if they were to combine the resources of all the classes and clans, they would never have the chance to catch up to Fang Xinjian in this lifetime. However, on the other side, Rhoda let out a furious bellow. Agitated ether particles surged out in all directions with her body as the source. Her pitch-black long hair fluttered, burning in the air like blazing flames, making her look like a goddess in the night sky. Her exquisite skin, slim waist, and long legs exuded a soul-stirring charm. At the same time, scorching rays of light shot out from her eyes. Her hair was aging at a speed that could be seen by the naked eye. While she was beautiful, she also had an additional heroic spirit that was unique to female knight. Claude was shocked and said, "Rhoda, what are you doing?" Fang Xinjian was clearly using a killing technique that damaged his foundation. Rhoda's eyes were bloodshot as she glared at Fang Xinjian, who was holding onto his sword, and said coldly, "Fang Xinjian, you've humiliated us and now you're thinking of leaving?" Fang Xinjian threw her a glance and said, "There are so many knights in the academy, but you, a girl, are the most courageous. But my fists are bigger and tougher than yours. Even if I humiliate you, what can you do?" Hints of killing intent flashed on Rhoda's face as she said with a pause between each word, "I started cultivating spear arts at the age of 5. For over 20 years, I've been treading on thin ice, trembling in fear. I've maintained my condition every day, racking my brains, not daring to slack off in the slightest. I want to make it so that no one in this world can bully and humiliate me. Fang Xinjian, you have extraordinary talent and aptitude. You can defeat me, but you cannot humiliate me and my spear art. Because a knight's body can be defeated, but a knight's honor cannot be casually insulted." With each sentence she spoke, the waves of ether particles on her body grew even more intense. The divine light in her eyes continued to surge, as if 2 beams of plasma light were shooting out incessantly. After saying her last sentence, Rhoda grabbed out across space. The ether particles that were everywhere in the air gathered together at a speed that could be seen by the naked eye. Countless waves continued to stack up, revealing a crimson-red long spear. Effulgence weapon. He actually used it in the night level. Renaud, Xiao-Yi, and Claude abruptly raised their heads and looked at Rhoda, whose long black hair was turning yellow and white. Guilt and understanding appeared in their eyes. After Rhoda said this, Fang Xinjian's eyes widened for the first time. He carefully looked at Rhoda and said, "Rhoda, right? I'll remember you. What you said is very good. A knight's body can be defeated, but a knight's honor cannot be casually insulted. You're right. I'll remember this." But, when he said the word, but, Fang Xinjian was still standing at his original spot. However, when he said the word, yes, Fang Xinjian was already standing next to Rhoda, with one hand on her shoulder. No one in the entire place was able to see how he had done it. No matter how impassioned one is, it won't be able to change the difference in reality. A person's abilities won't increase just because of a few words. But Rhoda, I'll remember your name. Fang Xinjian's finger tapped lightly on Rhoda's forehead. A soft sound rang out, and Rhoda's brain was concussed continuously. She was about to faint very soon. The waves of ether particles throughout Rhoda's body weakened due to the weakening of her consciousness. In the end, she could only hear Fang Xinjian saying, "You can try to work harder and see if you can catch up to me." Rhoda only felt that Fang Xinjian's words were filled with boundless coldness and loneliness. The next moment, her body turned limp and she fainted completely. Fang Xinjian caught her body and placed her on the ground. He then turned his head, looked at Renaud and the other two and asked, "Do you guys still want to fight?" Claude was the first to step out and said calmly, "Fang Xinjian, you've won this time around. After I've mastered the 100 poison battle physique, I'll challenge you again." With that, he left without even turning back. The strong wind blew his hair, revealing his bare chest. He was like a lion on the plains. Renaud and Xiao-Yi exchanged a glance, their eyes filled with fury and embarrassment. They left without saying a word. Although they had been shocked by Rhoda's pride, it was impossible for their feelings of fury and jealousy toward Fang Xinjian to be expressed with just a few words. Fang Xinjian casually dissipated the sword cheese and threw the weapons of the four onto the ground. Just then, 2 sharp whistles rang out, accompanied by 2 black lines in midair. The headmaster and Huang Lin appeared once again. Seeing the 2 of them appear, Hailong, who was behind Dick, was the first to step out and shout, "Headmaster, Master Huang Lin." Fang Xinjian randomly attacked students in the academy, injuring over 10 of them. He's lawless and has no regard for the academy's rules. He even tore down 3 villas, injuring over 10 servants. Seeing this, Dick laughed coldly in his heart. "Idiot, you were the first to charge up. The headmaster will definitely remember you." As expected, Headmaster Jackson was still thinking of how to get Fang Xinjian out of this. But when he saw Hailong, who had come up, he frowned. This was simply forcing him to abdicate in front of everyone, threatening the leader. Of course, he could not reprimand Hailong immediately. He merely took a long look at Hailong, remembering his identity, and said slowly, "Fang Xinjian, is what Hailong said true?" Hailong said proudly, "Headmaster, now that we have all the evidence, there are so many teachers and students here who saw him attacking Renaud and the other 3, and even severely injuring Rhoda. We must punish this maniac severely." Jackson's frown deepened, but Hailong was still unaware of this and continued to speak arrogantly. Jackson had already made his evaluation of Hailong in his heart. Although his talent in martial arts isn't bad, his brain isn't very bright and he doesn't have any sensitivity at all. He's only suitable to be a fighter. It was only when Fang Xinjian glared at Hailong that Hailong stopped talking and subconsciously took 3 steps back. Then he realized that with the headmaster right next to him, how could Fang Xinjian still dare to be arrogant enough to hit him? His face turned red and he bellowed, "Fang Xinjian, the headmaster is right here. Are you still not convinced and want to attack me again?" Long-winded. With a flash, Fang Xinjian disappeared and reappeared from his original spot. Hailong, who was at the other side, had yet to react when he was sent flying, spinning. An intense pain appeared on his face, and when he was in midair, he spat out 2 teeth. He looked at Fang Xinjian with a flushed face, unable to believe that the other party could be so arrogant. He shouted loudly, "Fang Xinjian!" Hailong was sent flying once again, and this time around, even the other side of his face was swollen. He wanted to shout again, but Fang Xinjian's gaze was fixed on him like a sword's edge. It was as if his voice had been nailed to his throat. Hailong could only look toward the headmaster for help. The headmaster did not even look at him. Instead, he frowned and looked at Fang Xinjian, asking, "Fang Xinjian, you've randomly attacked students in the academy and destroyed the dormitories. Do you have anything else to say?" "I have nothing to say, headmaster. I'm willing to accept the punishment." However, Huang Lin's eyes were filled with smiles. To him, his disciple should be this arrogant and powerful. Fang Xinjian had single-handedly defeated the strongest few students in the academy with just his sword. This was a great honor to him. It also showed how monstrous Fang Xinjian's talent and aptitude were. Jackson glared at Fang Xinjian and Huang Lin, saying, "Since that's the case, I'll punish you by depriving you of your allowance for the next 6 months. You'll also be sent to the reflection chamber for 1 month." Seeing how the punishment ended so simply and how the headmaster, Fang Xinjian, and the others left, Hailong covered his face in a daze. He looked toward the direction where the headmaster had disappeared, as if coming to a realization. Only now did he feel how much the headmaster doted on Fang Xinjian. In that instant, a hint of panic and loss appeared in his eyes. "This won't do. I need to look for Li Er's father, Instructor Whitebeard, and get him to put in a good word for me." Chapter 112. In the Academy's reflection chamber, Fang Xinjian sat cross-legged on the floor, continuously rehearsing the nurturing sword techniques he had picked up from the process of consecutively defeating a few prefectural champions. This time around, he had picked up another 4 sets of nurturing sword technique. With the reinforcement of the unparalleled sword intent, the speed at which he picked up sword techniques increased. It was as if he could pick them up the moment he learned them, and the moment he practiced them, he became proficient. In less than a day, all 4 sets of nurturing sword techniques had already reached level 10. It was a pity that they all overlapped with the nurturing sword techniques he had cultivated in the past, and were unable to increase his additional attribute. Despite this, he continued to cultivate, hoping to reach the maximum level and increase the progress of his unparalleled sword intent. Although Fang Xinjian was in the reflection chamber, the academy did not reduce his meals. Under the headmaster's arrangements, a large amount of ferocious beasts and high-grade medicinal food were continuously sent in to replenish the vital energy and blood he had expended during his training. Of course, there was also the body-tempering ointment he had won from the bet with Tresia. All these things added together could increase his potential by at least 1,000 points every day. It was an extremely extravagant amount. Just like that, he would cultivate his sword techniques every morning, and in the afternoon, Lilia, Jack, and Anthony would rush to the reflection chamber and stand outside the metal window, allowing Fang Xinjian to guide them on their sword techniques, sorting out and summarizing their sword techniques bit by bit. Lilia and the other 2 stood outside the metal window, continuously practicing the martial arts that Fang Xinjian had guided them. Regardless of whether it was Lilia, Jack, or Anthony, all of them were extremely serious in their training. It was because Fang Xinjian had proven himself to be correct time and time again, especially when he had consecutively challenged 6 prefectural champions, proving his authority in sword arts. Fang Xinjian's eyes were like sharp sword gleams, occasionally sweeping past the bodies of the 3 of them. With the reinforcement from his unparalleled sword intent, he was able to see each and every one of their movements clearly. Their flaws were continuously magnified in his eyes. every hint of incomplete force, every wastage of power, and even the slightest hindrance in the circulation of vital energy and blood were all seen by him. Then with a slight flick of his finger, sword cheese swept out in the confinement room. He used his sword fingers to move the atmosphere, creating strong currents of sword cheese that struck Lilia's body. The latter's body trembled slightly and a trace of red flashed across his face. At the same time, he felt the force enter his body. He closed his eyes and experienced the feeling of the force circulating in his body, carefully savoring the taste. After a while, she began to practice her swordsmanship again. One could feel that her swordsmanship movements had gained a charm that was absent in the past. As Fang Xinjian guided them, he got used to the existence of the unparalleled sword intent, increasing his proficiency in nurturing techniques, and also practicing the supreme Mistwind sword in the process of guiding them. On the other hand, Lilia and the others could feel that under Fang Xinjian's guidance, their martial techniques had improved by leaps and bounds. There was no need for them to use their brains to understand the principles behind the martial technique. As long as they followed the guidance given by Fang Xinjian and learned and simulated the force they sent out, their proficiency in the techniques would soar up at a crazy rate. 1 day of training was comparable to 10 days of training in the past. The moves of the martial techniques were the same for everyone, but everyone's physical bodies were different. Therefore, when the same move was performed by different people, there would be slight differences. However, Fang Xinjian's control over the movements of the physical body and the strength of the body was already at the level of a grandmaster. He was the authority amongst the authorities, able to guide people in the most correct direction. This kind of carefree cultivation was addictive. They could not wait to be together with Fang Xinjian 24 hours a day, receiving his guidance at all times. Just as they were receiving guidance, Ferdinand, Zhou Yong, and Carter also arrived at the confinement room. Ferdinand did not say a word, but brought over 2 booklets and said, "Xinjian, I heard that you're collecting nurturing sword techniques? Although our Aristocrat Knight Academy isn't famous for our sword arts, we've also collected some sword technique. I've gotten someone to bring them over. Take a look and see if they're suitable." Zhou Yong and Carter also walked over. Right now, they were completely convinced of Fang Xinjian's abilities and took out all the nurturing sword techniques they could collect, as well as 50 gold each as an apology gift. With a sweep of Fang Xinjian's sword fingers, a total of 4 secret manuals were brought over to him by over 10 streams of sword cheese. The secret manuals flipped through rapidly in the breeze, and after a short half an hour, he had already learned all the sword techniques in the manual. Another 4 sets of nurturing sword techniques appeared on his stats window. Ferdinand looked at Lilia and the others, who were practicing under Fang Xinjian's guidance, and his eyes shone with envy. He plucked up his courage and asked, "Xinjian, can I get you to give me some guidance in my martial arts?" He was not envious of Lilia and the others' rapid improvement, as he did not know the effects of Fang Xinjian's guidance. He was just envious that they could get close to Fang Xinjian. In the academy, even a fool would know that Fang Xinjian had a bright future ahead of him. After all, not only did he have extraordinary talent, he had transitioned into a windstorm sword hero and had even broken through the speed of sound. There was also the faint backing of an important character, and even the Royal Knight Association could not do anything to him. Ferdinand thought to himself, Fang Xinjian is just about to rise up. With his talent, even if he can't become a divine-level character in the future, he'll definitely become a second transition level 29 pillar of the country, an important character like Governor Devitt. If I can find a chance to get on good terms with him now, I'll be able to reap huge profits in 10 years' time. Fang Xinjian threw a glance at him, then at Zhou Yong and Carter, saying, "Sure. Tell everyone in the academy that anyone can come to me to receive my guidance. It's just that they must bring at least one sword technique, be it nurturing, training, or killing technique." Fang Xinjian knew that the unparalleled sword intent was a sword technique that had reached the maximum level. Although he wanted to accumulate more nurturing techniques to increase his daily potential gain, he would not be stingy with learning other sword techniques to strengthen his sword intent. It was a pity that although Fang Xinjian had spread the news, other than Lilia, Jack, and Anthony, only Ferdinand came the next day. Zhou Yong was a sword practitioner, so of course he was willing to come and try out Fang Xinjian's guidance. Even if the guidance was ineffective, he would still be able to ease the tension between him and Fang Xinjian. However, he was a member of the Treasure clan. Coming to deliver the sword arts manuals the day before was already his limit. How could he possibly come to look for Fang Xinjian for guidance? As for Ferdinand, he was purely here to get closer to Fang Xinjian. His clan had already spoken to him, asking him to put in all his effort to get on good terms with Fang Xinjian. Carter, who had also come to deliver the secret manuals the day before, did not come. He was cultivating spear arts, and he was too embarrassed to come and get closer to Fang Xinjian. After all, they were all youngsters, full of youthful vigor. How many of them would admit that they were not as good as others when they were not even 20 years old? Only someone like Ferdinand, who had been nurtured by his parents as a master of the ways of the world, would do something like this. Seeing Lilia, Jack, and Anthony starting to practice their martial arts, occasionally sending out streams of sword cheese from Fang Xinjian's fingers, hitting their bodies, Ferdinand smiled and said, "Xinjian, what do you say? Are you going to spar with me using sword cheese, just like them?" Ferdinand was from an aristocratic family in Kurst. He was dressed in white robes, and with his fair complexion, he appeared to be very elegant. When he smiled like this, it made it easier for him to get close to others. Of course, this was how it looked on the surface. In fact, Ferdinand did not feel that Fang Xinjian would really be able to give him any guidance. After all, what he cultivated was the long spear, while Fang Xinjian cultivated sword art. It was just like how on Earth, if a boxer wanted to give guidance to a wrestler, the latter would obviously ignore him. The two of them might even end up fighting. Fang Xinjian looked at Ferdinand and nodded to himself. Back in Demonic City, he was also considered a second generation. Although he was not highly regarded, he had seen many other outstanding second generations. However, he could not help but admit that at least Ferdinand looked very outstanding. This was especially so when compared to Jack, Anthony, and even Lilia. This Ferdinand appeared to be very refined and polite, with a better disposition and self-restraint. Dressed in white robes, he had the demeanor of a noble young master. However, the long spear he carried on his back had a hint of killing intent, making him look more like a strategist on the battlefield. Chapter 113. Hearing Ferdinand's question, Fang Xinjian shook his head. Of course, it was impossible for him to use sword cheese to guide Fang Xinjian right from the start. After all, sword cheese were air, and he was attacking by lashing out at the air with his strength. This could transmit force, but it was impossible for him to sense the circulation of the other party's muscles through this. The confinement house he was in right now was made entirely out of stone, and there were only a few small windows that allowed him to look out onto the grass outside. It was not a problem for him to use it to observe other people's martial arts and then shoot out sword cheese to guide them. However, it was impossible for him to engage in close combat unless he tore down the house without any reservations. Therefore, Fang Xinjian said, "It's better for me to come out and spar with you personally. Otherwise, I won't be able to grasp your strength." "Come out?" Ferdinand was stunned. He looked toward the guard at the side. It was an old man who was about 50 to 60 years old with a head full of white hair. He was also the guard of the confinement house. Although he was not even at the level of a knight, as the guardian of the academy's rules, no one would dare to barge into his cell. Fang Xinjian looked at the old guard and said, "I'll spar with him outside." Although the guard hesitated for a moment, when he thought of Fang Xinjian's background and talent, he knew that Fang Xinjian would be able to chase him out of the academy with just a few words. How could he dare to offend someone like this? Therefore, he immediately smiled. "You're being too polite. If you really wish to go out, even 100 of me wouldn't be able to stop you." He smiled and opened the metal door of the stone house. Fang Xinjian walked out slowly. At the same time he walked out, the joints all over his body made explosive sounds, releasing crisp kacha-kacha sound. It was as if many firecrackers had exploded in his body. This was actually him circulating his force and circulating his vital energy and blood before the battle. Despite this, strong gales were created around Fang Xinjian, displaying great violence. This caused the corners of Ferdinand's eyes to twitch. Such prowess would usually only be displayed by knights who had cultivated for 3 years or more. When had Ferdinand ever seen someone in the same batch as him? When Lilia and the others saw Fang Xinjian come out, they all stopped what they were doing and looked at Fang Xinjian in anticipation. Lilia was especially excited. Her eyes were squinted like a cat in enjoyment, and her long legs were tightly clenched as she shouted, "Teacher is going to make another move? I feel that teacher is becoming more and more gentlemanly. Lilia, let me borrow your sword for a while." Hearing that, Lilia immediately tossed the sword over. Fang Xinjian caught it and waved it. The blade cut through the air, releasing a series of muffled sounds. He turned to look at Ferdinand and said, "You, Fang Xinjian, but don't use." Fang Xinjian is and said, "Fang Dan Xinjian." Ferdinand was slightly stunned. However, he was not a person who would drag things out. Thinking of Fang Xinjian's abilities, he knew that it was impossible for him to deal him a great deal of damage. Thus, in the next moment, he had his spear in hand and said, "All right, I'm coming." In that instant, Ferdinand's white robes fluttered and he dashed out. The long spear in his hand had already brought along an unparalleled spiral force, piercing toward Fang Xinjian's chest like a super big drill. Intense power was pushed from Ferdinand's body to his long spear. In this instant of charging, hints of ripples that distorted the air even appeared faintly on his long spear. It was as if a real dragon had traversed across void space and was about to engulf Fang Xinjian. This spear attack was so fast and violent that it could pierce through an elephant from head to tail. All of Ferdinand's powers were perfectly condensed into this spear attack. This was the true display of Ferdinand's physical strength and spear arts technique. However, Fang Xinjian's expression did not change in the face of this spear attack that was like a true dragon's breath. In fact, with the support of the unparalleled sword will in his eyes, this extremely condensed spear had too many flaws. With a flash of sword light, Fang Xinjian pierced out with his sword, lightly tapping on Ferdinand's spear. The latter's power dissipated, and he felt as if he was unable to advance or retreat. His countenance changed, and he immediately changed his move. With a flick of the tip of his spear, he flicked out toward Fang Xinjian with an upward force. Not only did this flick utilize Ferdinand's own strength, but it also retained 70% of the speed and power from the earlier thrust. It also contained the principle of leverage. If this flick were to be used in a modern battlefield, it would be sufficient to send a tank flying. Faced with this spear attack, Fang Xinjian continued to thrust out diagonally. Sword light flashed, and Ferdinand only felt that the long spear was moving crazily like a huge python struggling intensely, wanting to break free from his hand. Then he felt his hand becoming lighter, and the weapon in his hand had already been sent flying. What? How is this possible? Ferdinand looked at the long spear that had landed on the ground in disbelief. I started practicing spear arts at the age of 6, and the first thing I did was to hold onto the long spear tightly. The spear I'm holding onto right now, unless I'm willing to, even 10 wild bulls won't be able to pull it away. How on earth did he do it? I didn't feel a huge force coming at me. Looking at the stunned Ferdinand, Fang Xinjian said calmly, regardless of whether it's fist arts, sword arts, or spear arts, they are all based on the principles of the utilization of the muscles, bones, vital energy, blood, and internal organs. Naturally, there are many similarities between them. Earlier, your spear technique circulated like a dragon, unleashing a large portion of your powers. However, there are still flaws. That spear of yours you first thrust and then flick. What you're aiming for is a penetrating force. You need to twist all the powers in your body into the form of a real dragon and strike it out. In this spear attack, you used a few large muscles in your legs, waist, shoulders, and arms, as well as the power from the circulation of your vital energy and blood. Putting aside the utilization rate, although your muscles and bones are sufficiently condensed, there are still some flaws in the power of your vital energy and blood. However, this is not a problem with your technique. It's just that your chest is slightly wider than ordinary people, and your heart is slightly more inclined to the left. Hearing this, Ferdinand was taken aback. He also knew the weakness of his spear arts. It was that he was still lacking in the control of his internal organs and vital energy and blood. This was something that the seniors in his clan and the academy's instructors had mentioned to him before. However, he had not expected that Fang Xinjian would be able to see through this with just one exchange, even pointing out that his heart was slightly more inclined to the left. What kind of judgment did he have? However, being able to see through it was one thing. If he really wanted to improve it, he could only rely on cultivating bit by bit, slowly channeling his force into his internal and external organs, and then truly controlling both internal and external forces. This was a long-term project. Even many conferred knights with a strength attribute of over 100 points would not be able to truly control every single bit of power in their bodies, both inside and outside of their bodies. However, when Fang Xinjian saw Ferdinand's expression, he did not say anything. Instead, in the blink of an eye, with a flash of sword light, he slapped Ferdinand's waist. At the start, Ferdinand was stunned. He was about to dodge and counterattack, but when the force entered his body, he was stunned again. Fang Xinjian's voice rang out next to his ears. Chew on this force properly. This force flowed through Ferdinand's internal organs and blood vessels, all the way to his arm. In the end, it even circulated together with Ferdinand's muscle strength, thrusting out with his arm, releasing an explosive bang. This is the force channeled from that spear attack earlier. A hint of astonishment flashed in Ferdinand's eyes. Chapter 114. Ferdinand knew that Fang Xinjian was very talented. If he was not talented, how could he have transitioned into a windstorm sword hero? How could he have transcended sound at the age of 16? However, he had never thought that Fang Xinjian would be able to give him pointers on spear art. However, the scene before his eyes had shattered his common sense. The force that Fang Xinjian had struck onto his body was not only extremely accurate, but had also flowed through his vital energy, blood, and tendons, without causing any damage to his body in the slightest. What was even more terrifying was that this force was exactly the force that he had wanted to unleash with his earlier spear technique. Not only was it powerful, it was even more perfect, and the control over his vital energy and blood was even more suitable for his body. It was as if he had practiced this move for tens of years, and could be used as a standard by Ferdinand. Even he himself could not perform it. He looked at Fang Xinjian in astonishment and asked, "You've practiced this 100 Blossoms spear technique before?" "I've never practiced spear arts before." Fang Xinjian's longsword pierced out lightly, and accompanied by a terrifying whistling sound, it was as if a huge dragon had pounced out, causing the air before him to explode, releasing a crisp sound like that of a bomb. Feeling the compressed air blowing on his face, Ferdinand was even more astonished. He pointed at Fang Xinjian's longsword and said, This is the move from earlier?" However, he had after all practiced spear arts for over 20 years, and could immediately sense the minute differences. There are minute differences between swords and spears. The distance of the attack, the weight of the weapon, and the differences in the move. However, just from that thrust earlier there are many similarities. Fang Xinjian said, "The reason why I used my longsword to perform the spear technique from earlier was because I understood the force in that move. Knowing how to circulate the force makes things much easier." Knowing how to circulate the force makes things much easier? Ferdinand looked at Fang Xinjian with a different gaze than before. It was because he recalled what his grandfather had once told him. "Ferdinand, there's a type of genius in this world. No matter what martial technique is in their hands, they'll be able to master it the moment they learn it, and master it the moment they use it. It's because they've grasped the circulation of the human body's force. Therefore, all nurturing techniques and training techniques are no secrets to them, and they can even modify their moves according to the human body, displaying martial techniques that are most suitable for them. They have already reached the point where they have reached the same level of strength and are proficient in everything they learn. Once you meet such a genius, you must absolutely not become his enemy. If you have already become his enemy, then immediately run away and never go back." Ferdinand looked at Fang Xinjian, already treating him as a super genius who had the same level of force as him. He said respectfully, "It's been hard on you to guide me like this." Fang Xinjian did not mind the change in his attitude, because with his strength and talent, it was natural for him to be respected. This was especially so after he had obtained the unparalleled sword intent. Ordinary physical moves were no longer secrets to him, and he could find the similarities between sword technique. No matter what kind of move or technique it was, he would be able to see its flaws with just one look, and would be able to execute it with just a few exchanges. Of course, this was not because he had really learned the technique, but because he could imitate the same force movements he had seen in sword technique. Just like the jab of a fist, the thrust of a long sword, or the thrust of a long spear, they were all the same. Or the slash of a blade, the slash of a sword, or even the hack of a staff, they were all similar in terms of force exertion. Fang Xinjian's sword arts, because of the unparalleled sword intent and his talent in the world's #1 sword arts, had already reached the same level of force. Therefore, he was able to imitate other blade techniques, staff techniques, and even palm techniques and fist techniques, and execute the same force exertion. Even if he were to learn other types of martial techniques now, he would be able to pick them up very quickly. However, this would be equivalent to starting all over again, and there was clearly no need for this. Moreover, because his nurturing and training techniques covered almost every inch of his flesh and blood, even if he were to learn other types of martial techniques, it would only be a waste of time. However, if he were to use such means to guide others, it would be too terrifying. Therefore, for the next hour, Ferdinand continued to perform various spear techniques, nurturing, training, and even killing techniques, to attack Fang Xinjian. Each time, they would be easily countered by Fang Xinjian. Fang Xinjian then pointed out the flaws in his martial techniques, and in the end, he would send a force through his body, allowing him to slowly digest the meaning behind it. So that's how it is, so that's how it is. I've always thought that my 100-blossom spear technique has already reached perfection, but I don't know why I'm still unable to reach level 10 after so long. It's because I'm lacking that little bit of energy from the beating of the atrium. However, the atrium is inside the human body and is extremely fragile and delicate. If one were to circulate energy here, the slightest carelessness would result in internal injuries, or even death. Only you, Xinjian, who has reached the realm of interlinked forces, would be able to grasp the circulation of my body so easily, and even be able to demonstrate the power to the standard. Ferdinand looked at Fang Xinjian in astonishment, his gaze filled with a sense of exhilaration. Under Fang Xinjian's guidance, he was able to find the most accurate circulation of force in an instant. To a martial artist, this was an extremely satisfying experience. It was just like a high school student doing physics questions, with someone explaining to him the correct solution process as he did so. There was no need for him to think about it in detail by himself. Hearing Ferdinand's words, Fang Xinjian nodded and said, "When practicing martial techniques, both nurturing and training techniques have to pay great attention to the standard of the movements, as well as the correct circulation of the muscles, vital energy, and blood. Only by doing so will one be able to increase the maximum potential, gain the most experience points, and achieve the best training result. Otherwise, not only will it be twice the effort, it will also cause harm to the body." Ferdinand nodded in agreement. It's the same for killing technique. Regardless of whether it's sword arts or spear arts, in the end, one still needs to perform the most basic moves such as thrusting, flicking, pointing, and parrying. Even when knights are fighting each other, once they enter into close combat, other than the extraordinary power of killing techniques, the physical strength of the killing techniques is also very important. If one is able to perfectly control one's force while practicing the nurturing techniques into one's killing techniques, one would be terrifying in close combat. When he said the word terrifying, Ferdinand took a long look at Fang Xinjian, thinking that the current Fang Xinjian was truly terrifying. Early the next morning, Ferdinand brought Carter, who was also cultivating spear arts like him, along with 3 other knights from other classes. All of them were seniors from the same academy as him. Ferdinand called out to Fang Xinjian, "Xinjian, see if you can spar with our 3 seniors and give them some guidance." The corners of Fang Xinjian's lips curled up slightly as he said calmly, "Each of you just have to provide me with a sword arts manual that the academy doesn't have." Although these knights practiced spear arts, with their status and influence, it would not be difficult for them to find a sword arts manual that the academy didn't have. Moreover, they had already heard of Ferdinand's request and had brought it here today. After keeping the manual, Fang Xinjian walked out slowly, took Lilia's longsword, and said to the 3 of them, "All of you can attack together." The 3 of them knew how strong Fang Xinjian was. How could he not be strong when he had challenged 6 prefectural champions in a row? However, they still had some doubts about what Ferdinand had said about Fang Xinjian being able to give pointers to other people's saber, spear, staff, and rod techniques after he had reached the same level as force. Even if you, Fang Xinjian, have great talent and unparalleled speed, but to be able to reach the level of being proficient in other types of martial arts, what kind of realm would that be? Could someone who had only practiced the sword for less than a year achieve that? They strongly doubted this. Hearing Fang Xinjian's words, they exchanged a glance and nodded secretly. "Then I'll be counting on you to give me some pointers." The next moment, 3 beams of cold light lit up, like 3 flood dragons overturning the seas and rivers, tearing through the atmosphere, bringing with them the smell of burnt metal. With the prowess of meteorites descending from the sky, they pierced toward Fang Xinjian. Chapter 115. Faced with the 3 long spears that were charging toward him at the same time like 3 stinger missiles, the longsword in Fang Xinjian's hand sent out a myriad of cold gleams. It was as if it was an anti-missile system, and he tapped on each of the 3 long spears at the critical moment. The other party's long spears pierced out at full force, moving at a speed as fast as a stinger missile. Moreover, when the spear tips exerted force, they trembled incessantly like flower buds, making it hard for one to sense where they were going to land. The entire process tore through the air, bringing about a tremendous sound wave attack that could almost send ordinary men tumbling. These 3 spears were like the moves had been transformed into dishes, displaying the sounds, colors, and tastes to the extreme. As the saying went, ruling a great country is like cooking a small fish. And right now, these 3 people's spear arts had reached a level where it was like cooking a small fish. How astonishing was their prowess and attainments! When Lilia, Ferdinand, and the others saw this scene, They all felt that it was an extremely dangerous situation. If they were in Fang Xinjian's shoes, they would not even be able to dodge, let alone block. It was because these 3 spears were too dangerous and too violent. However, these 3 spears, which were like cooking a small fish, passed by in the blink of an eye, trembled incessantly, and even used sound waves to confuse the enemy, were able to hit on the 3 long spears with great accuracy in the blink of an eye, scattering the force that the other party had channeled into the spears. How accurate and fast was this! Almost at the instant when Fang Xinjian tapped out the 3 sword attacks, the other party's 3 long spears were like huge dragons whose tendons had been pulled out and whose skin had been peeled off. They lost all their strength and fell to the ground. The 3 of them gasped and retreated, looking at Fang Xinjian as if they were looking at a freak. One of them, a man with a full beard, said, "What a guy! You've learned our long sky spear technique before?" Fang Xinjian shook his head and said, "I've never learned it before." Another knight with a mustache stroked his beard and said, "Then why were you able to see the flaws in our spear technique at the first instant?" Fang Xinjian thought for a moment and said, "He was there. I saw him." The 3 knights fell silent and exchanged glances. In the next moment, the tips of their spears moved. The 3 of them directly attacked from 3 different positions. The tips of the spears in their hands brought with them a myriad of cold stars, like a river of stars, which enveloped Fang Xinjian. Faced with such an overwhelming and majestic attack, ordinary people would be flustered, not knowing where they should defend. Even Lilia, Ferdinand, and the others, who were watching from the side, could only think of retreating first. They must not be stuck to by this attack. However, Fang Xinjian's expression remained the same. He looked at the stars in the sky and struck out 3 more times. With 3 strikes, the stars in the sky disappeared. Only 3 of them fell to the ground like meteors, unable to move. The leader with a full beard looked at Fang Xinjian in astonishment and said, "You can even see the flaws?" With that, without waiting for Fang Xinjian to react, he shook his head. "Your sword is not only fast, but stable as well. Your muscles, bones, vital energy, blood, and organs are all stable to the point where there are no flaws at all. With such stamina and strength, you must have reached the maximum level for a few sets of basic sword techniques, right?" Although the main purpose of nurturing and training techniques is to temper one's attributes, they actually contain the most basic methods to circulate one's force in all martial technique. In a battle between knights, killing techniques are the most important. The first is the competition of extraordinary strength, and the second is close combat. However, in order to be strong in close combat and have a strong foundation, one must thoroughly understand nurturing and training technique. To be able to circulate one's muscles and bones, to push one's vital energy, blood, and organs into close combat is the true terror. Saying that, he shook his head. "It's a pity that we've only understood this logic in the past year, and you're already ahead of us. It's a joke that everyone thinks that you're able to move about freely because of the Windstorm Sword Hero's unparalleled speed. But it's only when you've slowed down that we know the true terror of your sword arts." That was indeed the case. In the past, Fang Xinjian's battle speed had been too fast. With a series of lightning attacks, his opponents would usually be lying on the ground before they could even understand what was going on. And now, he wanted to use the excuse of guiding others in their cultivation to gather sword technique. Naturally, he had the intention to slow down his movements and show off his own sword arts cultivation. Ferdinand's eyes revealed a contemplative expression. Although he also felt that Fang Xinjian's interlinked forces was very powerful, he was not clear on how powerful it was. It was only when the bearded man spoke of it that he came to a realization. The bearded knight said, "You're able to see through the flaws in our moves with one look. Your sword arts cultivation is not to be underestimated. We also wish to spar with you and cultivate our spear art." Fang Xinjian nodded, "You're most welcome." Lilia, who was at the side, twitched her lips and said unhappily, Why are there more people here? Won't the time for Master to guide me be getting shorter and shorter? Don't these people have their own teachers? Ferdinand smiled. Little Lily. Don't call me little Lilia. Lilia cried out like a little tiger baring its fangs and brandishing its claws. Seeing that Ferdinand did not seem to mind, she pouted and punched him in the stomach. At the start, Ferdinand did not think much of Lilia's punch. After all, she was not even a knight, so how much strength could she have? But at the next moment, seeing the strong gales blowing toward him, his countenance changed. However, Lilia was too close to him, and he could not block it in time. He could only perform his reduced force field, covering Lilia's fist like a spider web. That delicate little fist seemed as if it was made of jade, but when it hit Ferdinand's stomach, it was as if a crazed elephant had rammed into it. Ferdinand let out a strange cry, his face turning green. His eyes popped out as he looked at Lilia in disbelief. He felt as if his intestines had been broken. Cursed city lord, that old B** starred. What on earth did he feed his daughter? Was it a dragon? It was only because of his good physique that he was able to receive this punch in a state where he was completely defenseless. If it had been someone else, they would have been smashed into pieces by this punch. Jack and Anthony were laughing secretly at the side. This was not the first time they had been taken advantage of by Lilia's monstrous strength. Now that they saw that Ferdinand had also been taken advantage of, they felt an indescribable sense of gloating. Lilia let out a cold laugh, blew on her fist and said, "If you continue to shout, it won't be here next time." With that, she threw a glance at the area below Ferdinand's stomach. Ferdinand broke out in cold sweat, and Jack and Anthony, who were at the side, subconsciously felt a chill run down their spines. Ferdinand coughed a few times to hide his awkwardness. Lilia. Seeing her murderous gaze, he immediately changed his words. "Miss Lilia, although I don't know why, I can tell that your master wants to collect sword techniques. That's why he used the excuse of providing guidance as an excuse to gather everyone here. Not only will he be able to collect sword arts manuals, but he will also be able to learn from others' strong points in the process of providing guidance. Although I don't know why, I feel that your master's sword arts must have reached some kind of bottleneck, and he wants to take a look at the sword arts from other factions as a reference. Of course, it's more likely that Xinjiang wants to make use of this power to establish his authority and unify the powers in the academy." However, Lilia did not hear what Ferdinand said after that. "What?" Lilia slapped her thigh and said, "There are many sword techniques in my library. I'll go get them for Master right away." Ferdinand gasped, his legs turning limp as he fell to the ground. He touched his inner thigh and said, "Why did you hit my thigh?" Lilia touched the back of her head and smiled. I'm sorry. Wait here. I'll go back to my library to get the secret manuals." Chapter 116. Ferdinand shook his head and smiled as he looked at the interaction between Fang Xinjiang and the three knights. The leader of the three knights who cultivated in spear arts was Sandro. The three of them were not only his seniors in the aristocrat academy, but they were also one of the experts in the academy. Moreover, their strength lay in their understanding of spear arts and martial technique. Disregarding the advantages of attributes and extraordinary strength, they could be ranked in the top 10 out of the 80-odd knight students in the academy. They were publicly acknowledged as experts in close combat and technique. Ferdinand guessed that Fang Xinjiang had the intention to make use of the fact that he had challenged 6 prefectural champions in a row to establish his authority in the entire academy, so as to make all the students in the academy his own people. Of course, he did not know that he had not guessed correctly. Fang Xinjiang only wanted to collect sword technique. However, this did not stop Ferdinand from thinking of ways to help Fang Xinjiang. He had made use of his connections to invite Sandro and the other two because he was sure that Fang Xinjiang, who had the same level of strength as them, had the ability to guide the three of them and crush them in terms of martial arts technique. As long as he made a name for himself, the number of people who would come to seek guidance from Fang Xinjian would naturally increase. As someone who had personally tasted the profoundness of Fang Xinjian's sword techniques, Ferdinand firmly believed that as long as all the students in the academy had tried it, no one would be able to resist the temptation of receiving guidance from Fang Xinjian. As long as one was a knight, he would definitely be intoxicated by the feeling of constantly growing stronger and gaining a thorough understanding of everything. The truth was similar to what Ferdinand had thought. As the reputation of Fang Xinjian's guidance spread out, especially after the spear arts experts Sandro and the other two admitted that Fang Xinjian's sword techniques were unfathomable and far surpassed any other students or instructors, more and more people came to the confinement room to seek guidance from Fang Xinjian. However, this also affected the students in many aspects. In a vast training room, more than 10 knight students wielding 2-meter-long spears were constantly shaking the spears. Each spear was like a giant python that was constantly shaking the air and emitting buzzing sounds. Their spears moved in tandem, chopping, bursting, thrusting, or flicking, displaying the basic skills of the spear. As for the most experienced knights, the great spears in their hands were like bolts of lightning. Every time they vibrated, it was as if a thunderbolt had struck the sky, stirring up layers of ripples in the air. An instructor in his 50s with a goatee walked back and forth among the students. He looked at the knights wielding their spears, nodding and shaking his head from time to time. He was the instructor of this spear skills cram school. Just like the schools on Earth, the instructors here wanted to earn extra income, and the students wanted to improve their skills, so cram schools came into being. And a top-notch instructor like Goatee had to charge 2 gold coins a month for tuition. Almost every month, he would be able to earn dozens of gold coins. When practicing spear skills, shaking the great spear is the most basic of the basic. The waist and hip must be as one, the eyes and hands must be in sync, the breath must be like thunder, and the spear must be like a dragon. Only by remembering these 4 points can you increase your physical strength and improve your skills. After practicing like this for another half an hour, the instructor stopped and said, "All right, today's warm-up will end here. Next, all of you come and stab me with your great spear." Stab each other with the great spear was a very cruel method in spear training. After all, the two of them were wielding 2-meter-long spears. It was not like fighting with bare hands or swords, where one could hold back. Stab with the great spear would often leave a large hole in the opponent's body, and the opponent would either be dead or heavily injured. Only a goateed instructor like Zhang Xian, who had the strength of a pinnacle knight, and whose opponents were all talented official knights, would dare to train in such a manner. If an ordinary army trained like this, perhaps half of them would die every year. However, it was this kind of valiant training that could stimulate a person's body, reaction, and mental endurance. It would allow a person to be calm in real battles, and even face death directly. After the goatee instructor finished speaking, the long spear in his hand trembled violently, emitting a vigorous feeling of power. Everyone felt as if they had suddenly arrived at a battlefield, in the midst of thousands of soldiers and horses, in the midst of a bloody atmosphere. Clearly, this goatee instructor was not only strong and had exquisite spear skills, he was also a knight who had retired from the battlefield. However, at this moment, he frowned and his face was filled with killing intent. Where's Paro? Where did he go? Why didn't he come to the spear skills class for 2 consecutive days? The students looked at each other in dismay, not daring to reply. The goatee instructor pointed his spear at one of the students and said, "You are very familiar with Paro. Do you know where he went? Why didn't he come to the spear skills class?" As he pointed his spear, the air boiled and the sound of the spear vibrated violently. It actually produced a loud sound like a hammer striking metal. This time, a sonic boom was produced. Of course, this sonic boom was not as shocking as Fang Xinjian's. After all, as an experienced instructor who had been in the first transition for decades, it was very normal for his attacks to reach supersonic speed. However, it could not be compared to Fang Xinjian's supersonic speed at the age of 16. The surrounding students had long since understood their instructor's abilities and were not surprised. However, the student whose spear was pointed at still felt his ears go numb. It was as if his brain had been punched out of nowhere, and he could not even stand stably. His face turned pale and he said, "Instructor, Paro has gone to Fang Xinjian's place." "That Fang Xinjian again?" The goatee instructor frowned. Of course, he knew of this Fang Xinjian. In the interclass competition, Fang Xinjian had taken on 10 people by himself, and had then consecutively challenged 6 prefectural champions. Everyone in the academy knew of him. However, recently, Fang Xinjian had started to guide the students in their martial arts. Many students even skipped their martial arts classes and went to listen to his guidance instead. This Fang Xinjian has only been practicing the sword for a year. Even if he has outstanding talent and has transitioned into a windstorm sword hero, that's only because he has an advantage in attributes, specialties, and killing technique. What sword arts could he possibly know at such a young age? He's just relying on his fast speed and great strength. The goatee instructor felt disdain in his heart, but his expression did not change. Moreover, even if he knows martial arts, it's still sword art. Paro is learning the spear from me. Asking him to guide his spear arts? What nonsense! Of course, what he hated the most was that Fang Xinjian had snatched his student away. He was here charging fees for his lessons, but Fang Xinjian was there to collect sword arts manuals and recruit students as he pleased. Wasn't this equivalent to snatching his rice bowl? Knights also needed to eat, and the tuition classes had always been a large part of their income. How could they possibly give up on it? These senior instructors in the academy might not be as talented as many prefectural champions, but all of them had been immersed in their respective martial arts for decades, tempering their attributes and waves for so many years. Almost all of them were above ordinary prefectural champions, and they were existences that far surpassed most students. Of course, the abilities of first transition knights were also divided into many levels. Unless the difference in talent was too great, there would definitely be a difference between those who had only cultivated for 1 or 2 years and those who had cultivated for 7 or 8 years. For people like Hamel, Ralph, and Taro, they had basically completed most of the plans for their knight attributes, specialties, and killing technique. They were considered first-rate knights in the first transition. And for people like the goatee instructor, who had accumulated decades of cultivation and was still in the first transition, they were considered to be at the pinnacle of the first transition. Further up would be people like Treja clan's Rebecca, who was a first transition elder from a major clan or faction. Not only had they accumulated decades of cultivation, but they had also consumed countless heavenly and earthly treasures and cultivated many secret manuals. They could even defeat some ordinary conferred knights who had just completed the second transition. As for senior instructors like the goatee instructor, as the pinnacle of the first transition, they were strong enough, but their potential had been exhausted and they were unable to pass the talent assessment of the regional selection. Otherwise, they would definitely participate in the regional selection and not stay here as instructors. But even if their potential had been exhausted, after decades of cultivation, they were all experts in spear arts, sword arts, staff arts, fist arts, and other martial arts. Naturally, they looked down on people like Fang Xinjian, who had high talent and relied on his attributes and specialties to crush his opponent. They admired Fang Xinjian's talent and envied his aptitude, but they would never directly admire the sword arts of someone who had only cultivated for a year. Those knights who had only cultivated for a few years, no matter how outstanding they were merely students in their eyes. Moreover, they had a vague feeling that Fang Xinjian would need at least a few more years to surpass the attributes, specialties, and killing techniques that they had cultivated for decades. This was especially so for senior instructors like the goatee instructor. Back then, he had been the prefectural champion and the trump card of the Razor team when he was in the army. It was just that he had not been able to pass the regional selection and break through the bottleneck of the second transition. He had been wasting his time, and now, he no longer had any hope of breaking through the second transition. Despite this, almost all of his 5 attributes were above 90 points, and he had learned over 10 sets of spear technique. He also had over 20 specialties and 3 killing technique. Even Hamel and Ralph, who were the strongest amongst the students, were merely children in his eyes. He even had the confidence that he would be able to get rid of them without having to use his extraordinary powers. He even had the confidence that he would be able to get rid of them through a sneak attack and close combat. Fang Xinjian might surpass him in the future, but at least for now, he definitely did not think that Fang Xinjian had already surpassed him in terms of extraordinary strength and close combat. This was especially so in terms of martial arts. He had the confidence to crush Fang Xinjian. However, Fang Xinjian was a very popular character in the academy, and he even had the headmaster backing him up. Although the goatee was a retired soldier with a fiery temper, he would not say anything easily, much less make an enemy out of him. However, Fang Xinjian had actually affected his income and snatched away his source of students. He had already planned to report this matter to the headmaster after class. He would definitely not let this matter rest just like that. He merely let out a cold laugh, pointed to another student and said, "Come, attack me with all your might." Chapter 117. A horseman holding a spear nodded. His entire body suddenly sprinted as if he was riding on a horse. A huge momentum gathered from his hands and feet to the spear in his hand. Like a meteor of lightning and fire, it pierced towards the goatee in a perfectly straight line. However, the spear in the goatee instructor's hand was like a flower blooming. It drew a semicircle and cut through the air, sounding like the wailing of ghosts and the howling of wolves. It was as if he was facing a meteorite falling from the sky, creating a barrier. In the next moment, the 2 great spears collided with each other. It was as if Mars had collided with Earth. The sound of a temple bell being struck could be heard. The student's spear was pushed away and pressed against the ground. Then, the instructor with the goatee kicked the student away. Seeing this, the goatee instructor sent the student flying. "Bastard!" he said angrily. "Galaxy style requires the spearhead to form the shape of a galaxy. How many times have I said it? Do you think these feints are useless? So you just use all your strength to complete a simple thrust? You are simply ignorant and incompetent. This move is not for you to use against your enemies, but for you to train. If you can form a true myriad stars, 9 flashes of cold light, then it means that you have grasped the great dragon of the spear. The force in your body will be endless, achieving the effect of stretching tendons and extending bones. How many times do I have to say that the spear techniques that I teach are passed down from generation to generation? They are moves that have been tempered hundreds and thousands of times. Every detail and every movement has complicated reasons and principles. You are not allowed to change a single move or a single move. Go and practice this move 1,000 times. If you don't finish practicing, you are not allowed to leave today." Although the student was a little afraid, he still plucked up his courage and said, "Instructor, when I went to listen to Fang Xinjian's lecture, he told me that moves with a form and trace are low-tier moves, while high-tier moves require the mind to move first. Only when the mind moves will the body move. When practicing martial arts, the movements must be standard. This is to build the foundation. However, for people like us who have practiced martial arts for a long time, after all the standard movements are in place, we should slowly correct our mistakes and change our stance bit by bit. This was because everyone's body was different. Therefore, when using a move, Whether it was for exerting strength in battle or for exercising one's health, it should be different according to one's own situation. Only by calming down the spirit and thrusting the spear out of inspiration can one use the mind to move the qi and blood, subdue the qi and blood in the body and the great strength in the organs. There is no need to deliberately pursue the subtle differences in the move. His words made a lot of sense, and even the students at the side were secretly nodding their heads, thinking that it made a lot of sense. However, the goateed instructor glared at him like two light bulbs. With a face full of anger, he said, "All right, all right, all right. It's Fang Xinjian again. Do you mean to say that when he gives pointers on spear techniques, he can give pointers to me?" The student was shocked and immediately lowered his head. Student doesn't dare. Actually, he had no intention of giving pointers to the instructor with the goatee. It was just that Fang Xinjian's words and demonstration the day before made him feel that they made sense. Therefore, he wanted to take them out to verify with the instructor and ask for his opinion. However, his way of doing things was obviously too naive. He had no grasp of the ways of the world. This was because things like martial arts could not be explained with words. Even if the instructor had 100 mouths and explained his reasoning, there would definitely be people in the group of students who felt that what he said was wrong. What should one do when faced with conflicting theories of martial arts? Most people would naturally fight it out, and whoever won would be in the right. And if the instructor was unable to resolve this matter with lightning speed, he would probably lose his prestige among the students in the future and would no longer be able to teach students. Speaking of which, it was Fang Xinjian who had spoken from afar. If even the instructor could not refute him, then who would listen to his spear techniques? This was not snatching his rice bowl, but destroying his rice bowl and cutting off his source of income. At this moment, the goateed instructor looked at the student in front of him who was laughing coldly in anger. In his heart, he hated Fang Xinjian even more. "Fang Xinjian, you're really too arrogant. If we were to let you continue teaching us like this, we won't even be able to make a living." He let out a cold laugh and shook the long spear in his hand, letting out a thunderous sound. "Fine, if you think that what Fang Xinjian said makes sense, then I'll go and have a spar with him right now. Let's see if he's right or if I'm in the right." This instructor was really someone with a fiery temper. Carrying a large spear on his shoulder, he raised his head and left, running like the wind towards where Fang Xinjian was at. In an instant, the remaining students burst into an uproar. "Teacher Zade wants to fight with Fang Xinjian? Quick! Go and watch. We definitely can't miss out on such a battle." That's right. Cursed Royal Knight Academy's #1 spear arts instructor against a windstorm sword hero who had challenged 6 prefectural champions in a row. Just the thought of such a battle made everyone's blood boil. Both of them were first transition knights whose attacks surpassed the speed of sound. Their sword arts and spear arts were extremely profound, and their abilities were above that of Hamel and the others. How exciting would such a battle be? Thinking of this, everyone present could not wait and ran towards the reflection chamber. On the other side, outside the confinement room, over 10 student knights were practicing different moves on the lawn. From time to time, a stream of sword chi would shoot out from the window of the confinement room and strike them, correcting their movements. And the one who attracted the most attention was Lilia, who was standing at the very front, brandishing her great sword. The tip of the young lady's nose was filled with perspiration, her ponytail bouncing with each swing of her sword. Her long, straight, and muscular legs continued to unleash a powerful force, creating many depressions in the ground. The young lady who was exercising was filled with a different kind of charm, attracting the gazes of many male knights. However, at the next moment, the earth suddenly seemed to tremble. Dust and grass danced in the air several hundred meters away, as if there were 10,000 horses galloping, or countless beasts charging over. That majestic aura and terrifying prowess were reflected in the hearts of everyone present. They could not help but stop what they were doing and look in the direction of the newcomer with full vigilance. In the next moment, a silhouette shot over like a sharp arrow. There were no strange footwork, nor were there any excessive moves. He just moved in a straight line, step by step, but at an unparalleled speed. In the blink of an eye, he had appeared before everyone. It was the Knight Academy's #1 spear arts instructor, Zada. Just him and his spear alone had the aura of 10,000 horses galloping. If such a person were to be in ancient China, he would be a match for 10,000 men, an existence akin to a god in the army. Throwing a cold glance at everyone, Zada let out a low bellow. His lungs moved, his throat trembled, and sound waves gushed out. A foul atmosphere. Fang Xinjian, come out. Ferdinand frowned, smiled and said, Teacher Zada, why have you come? Xinjian is currently in confinement and can't come out for now. Zada's seniority was very high, and his spear arts were top-notch amongst those in the first transition. He had even guided Ferdinand in spear arts when he was young. This let Ferdinand know how difficult it was to get along with him. Zada glanced at him coldly, then assessed the people who were still cultivating. He let out a cold snort and said, Ferdinand, it's not the place for a junior like you to speak here. Where is Fang Xinjian? I heard that he has an opinion about my spear arts teaching? Then I'll have to have a good chat with him. Ferdinand's heart sank. Just as he was thinking of how to appease Zada, Fang Xinjian's voice rang out from the stone house. I wonder how Teacher Zada wishes to have an exchange? Zada let out a cold laugh, sweeping the great spear in his hand. It was like a sharp sword that could slice through gold and jade, slashing through the air, and creating a circle with a diameter of 5 meters on the ground. Pointing the tip of his spear at the circle, Zada said, an exchange of spear arts would naturally be a contest of spears. Both you and I will stand in this circle, and each of us will wield our spears and stab each other. Whoever is stabbed to death or escapes from the circle will be considered the loser. Fang Xinjian, if you lose, you'll have to admit that your spear arts are beneath mine. You're not allowed to mislead the students and teach any other students spear arts. Chapter 118. The moment Zada said this, it immediately caused a commotion among the students present. As an experienced instructor in the academy, there was no need to doubt Zada's abilities. Tens of years of cultivation had long tempered his attributes, specialties, and killing techniques to the pinnacle of a first transition knight. Unless it was a first transition elder from a large clan, most first transition knights would not be a match for him. In the entire academy, only conferred knights like the headmaster and Huang Lin would be able to suppress an experienced instructor at Zada's level. And now, such a powerful knight was going to challenge Fang Xinjian. Especially the content of the challenge. Within a circle of a few meters, the two of them would use their spears to stab each other. Whoever died or fled would be considered the loser. Such rules were equivalent to a pure close combat fight, causing Fang Xinjian to lose his advantage in terms of movement speed and long-range sword cheese. On the contrary, Zada had trained in the long spear for tens of years. The 2-meter-long spear in his hands would hit wherever he pointed. With 92 points of strength, he was able to crush Fang Xinjian in terms of attribute. It could be said that he had the upper hand in a close combat fight like this. Therefore, the people in the surroundings were very shocked, followed by agitation and excitement. A close combat fight between two top-notch knights, with the slightest carelessness, could result in the death of the other party. How exciting was this? If it was in the modern world, such an action would definitely be reported. But in the Knight Academy, in this world of iron and blood, knights would only feel satisfied and exhilarated. This was what real combat training was. Otherwise, why would they be knights if they were afraid of death? But at this moment Lilia frowned and said, "Old man, what do you mean by this? My teacher is a windstorm sword hero. You want him to fight in close combat with you in the same circle? You might as well ask my teacher to tie his hands and feet to fight with you. After hearing this, Zada's expression remained calm and composed. He turned his spear and continued, "The reason why I'm here is to have an exchange of spear arts with Fang Xinjian. If it's a chase and a fight, what's the point? I don't play such tricks. Fang Xinjian, if you want to exchange pointers, then let's stab each other with our spears in this circle. Of course, if you're afraid of death, you can also admit defeat now." Although Zada had a fiery temper, he wasn't an idiot. His movement speed was not as fast as Fang Xinjian's windstorm sword hero. Even if he had secret techniques that allowed him to instantly unleash a sneak attack and a long-range attack, he did not have full confidence that he would be able to defeat Fang Xinjian in the process of pursuing him. If he were to fight with Fang Xinjian, it would be too embarrassing if the latter relied on his superior movement speed to keep him from reaching the edge, resulting in a draw. Seeing how calm and composed he was, Lilia was so infuriated that she gritted her teeth. However, she could not think of any rebuttal. At this moment, Fang Xinjian slowly walked out from the confinement chamber. He stepped into the circle under Zada's feet and exerted force with his hand. His ether force field had already snatched a longsword from a student at the side. Of course, there's no problem in exchanging pointers. But compared to spears, I still prefer swords. Today, I'll use swords as spears and spar with teacher Zada. Using swords as spears? Zada's eyes narrowed, as if there were blades flashing within them. As the saying goes, an inch longer, an inch stronger. In such a narrow circle, a 2-meter-long long spear would basically be able to pierce wherever it wanted to. Now, Fang Xinjian actually wanted to use a steel sword that was slightly over 1 meter long to spar with Zada. This was equivalent to giving Zada even more advantages. It could be said that it was extremely thrilling. Very good. Fang Xinjian, you're really good. In such a small circle, you're neither running nor escaping. Instead, you're using a steel sword to fight against my long spear. You're very courageous. As long as you don't die, your achievements in the future will definitely be greater than what I've imagined. The cultivation of us knights is like the fierce thrusting of a great spear. We have to focus on advancing forward with an indomitable will. Once we've set our minds on something, even 10,000 horses won't be able to pull it back. Since you're not afraid of death, I'm even less afraid of stabbing you to death with my spear. If you're able to win this match from my hands, then I'll admit that I'm not a match for you, Fang Xinjian. In the future, no matter what you do in the academy, I won't stop you. After saying that, Zada closed his eyes and his eyelids drooped. The killing intent from earlier had completely dissipated in an instant. This was the result of him accumulating all his killing intent and battle intent, waiting to erupt at the next moment. It was like when a volcano was not erupting, it was extremely peaceful, and one could even go on a tour and live nearby. It was also like the calm before a storm, where not even a single wave could be seen on the water's surface. But once an eruption occurred, regardless of whether it was a volcano or a storm, it would be world-shaking, destroying everything within its range. However, at the same moment when Zada closed his eyes, Ferdinand's eyes flickered and he said, "Teacher Zada, you came here directly and fought as you wish. If you lose, it means that you won't come looking for trouble anymore. Isn't this a little too unfair?" Zada coldly replied, "Then what do you want?" Ferdinand smiled and said, "Although Xinjian doesn't charge a fee for teaching us martial techniques, we still need everyone to hand over a sword arts secret manual. Teacher Zada is an experienced instructor in the academy, a top-notch knight. His status is not comparable to us students." Ferdinand had clearly placed his bets on the possibility of Fang Xinjian winning. Not only did he know that Fang Xinjian's sword arts had already reached the realm of force interlinked, but during the period of time when he was guiding Fang Xinjian in martial techniques, he had also been able to sense the disposition that Fang Xinjian was exuding from within. Right now, he was stepping up to fight for benefits for Fang Xinjian. Clearly, he and his clan had already decided to stand completely on Fang Xinjian's side. Zada said impatiently, "I've never collected sword art secret manuals, and I don't have such things in my hands. How about this: if I lose, I'll give you an empire's divine weapon." Ferdinand still wanted to speak up to fight for more benefits, but Fang Xinjian shook his head and said, "All right, Ferdinand. There's no need to be calculative about these small gains and losses. Teacher Zada, you can make your move." Zada's expression immediately turned solemn. His eyes were clearly closed, and there was not a hint of killing intent emanating from him. However, he gave the surrounding people an incomparably heavy feeling, just like the few seconds before the start of a battle between two armies. In the next moment, it was as if lightning had struck down from the sky. The long spear in Zada's hand brought along a beam of cold light, piercing towards Fang Xinjian like a rocket. As the spear pierced out, it immediately created a sonic boom. The spearhead of Zada's long spear drew out a white air current, and layers of reduced force field enveloped it, pushing the long spear layer by layer like a rocket. The distance between the two of them was not more than 2 meters, and the speed of this spear was extremely fast. Before anyone could react, the spearhead of Zada's spear was already less than an inch away from Fang Xinjian's chest. If this spear were to pierce through, it would directly create a large hole in Fang Xinjian's body, churning his internal organs into mush. Whatever reduced force field or night attire would not be able to block it. Chapter 119. The thrust of Zada's spear was completely propelled by his physical body and the reduced force field. Although there weren't any special effects of extraordinary strength, it was still extremely ferocious. Especially at such a short distance, it was an extremely thrilling experience. Facing this extremely ferocious attack, even Fang Xinjian could feel a sharp aura gushing towards him. His nerves tensed up as a sense of the threat of death filled his brain. It could be said that this was the only battle that could truly give Fang Xinjian the feeling of death after so many exchanges in the academy. It could be seen how ferocious and sharp Zada's spear arts were. However, Fang Xinjian's speed was unparalleled, and he had even comprehended the unparalleled sword intent. How could he not be able to receive a single spear attack from Zada? Sword light flashed continuously, as if there were 7 beams of light shooting towards Zada's spear. 7 points of force were directly broken, and Zada immediately felt that his spear's prowess was obstructed. To be able to see through the flaws of his spear arts in an instant, and even use a longsword to attack the flaws. How precise was his vision and sword arts! Zada's eyes turned sharper by several folds, as if streams of cold light were about to leap out from them. With the spear in his hand obstructed, he no longer pierced forward. Instead, he followed the direction where the spear was struck, and the tip of the spear drew a trajectory akin to a shooting star, slashing towards Fang Xinjian's lower abdomen. Not only was the tip of the spear not affected by the obstructed spear earlier, but it continued to attack along with the force, displaying Zada's standard of controlling the spear as he willed it. With this slash, the two forces mixed together, it was sufficient to slash apart the lower half of Fang Xinjian's body and pull out his large intestines. Faced with this vicious attack, Fang Xinjian was neither hurried nor slow. His body retreated, and at the same time, his longsword tapped on the spear's shaft, and then pressed down abruptly. With the sword pressing down, not only did it press down on the spear's weakest point, but it also had the power of Mount Tai pressing down. Within a short distance, the air exploded, letting out crackling sound. In the time it took for sparks to fly off a flint, the spear and sword clashed, letting out thunderous sounds. The speed and strength were so strong that a series of sparks were created on the two weapons. Fang Xinjian had relied on the unparalleled sword intent and his unparalleled speed to attack his opponent's flaws, dispersing Zada's spear art. Zada's eyes narrowed even more. Looking at the long sword that was pressing down on his spear, he did not circulate his strength to resist. Instead, he went along with Fang Xinjian's longsword's pressure, pressing his own spear to the ground as well. It was because if he were to retaliate, he would be attacking from below, giving Fang Xinjian an advantage for no reason. Instead, if he were to continue pressing down, he would be able to turn a losing move into a killing move with the help of the long spear's rebound force. With an explosive rumble, the tip of the spear was pressed into the ground by the explosive power of the two people at the same time. It directly smashed a large piece of soil, and even caused the spear shaft to be pressed into a large arc. One must know that the long spear in Zada's hand was as thick as an ordinary person's arm. To be able to force the spear shaft, which was made of steel, into an arc. What kind of violent force was this? With the help of the elasticity of the spear, in addition to the explosive force from Zada's hands, how ferocious would it be? Almost in the next moment, there was a muffled sound in the air, as if someone had hit Mercury with a sledgehammer. In that instant, the spear had become extremely fast and powerful. Before the spear could even straighten itself, the spearhead had already pierced right into Fang Xinjian's face. The speed of the spear was so fast that the intense friction with the air caused a scorching aura to spread out. In the face of this terrifying spear attack, Fang Xinjian remained as calm as ever as he circulated his mental cultivation method. The long sword in his hand was like a peacock spreading its tail, bringing about a 3-foot sword defense. Borrowing the force of the spear, he flew up. Seeing that Fang Xinjian had flown up in order to neutralize his killing move, Zada let out a cold laugh and went with the flow. With a push of his hand, he pierced the long spear in his hand towards Fang Xinjian, who was in the air. The long spear glowed with cold light. It was the galaxy stance, turning into a stretch of galaxy river that enveloped Fang Xinjian. However, even with Zada's skills, this galaxy stance was still full of flaws in Fang Xinjian's eyes. Faced against Fang Xinjian, who had grasped the unparalleled sword intent, all feints were useless. Fang Xinjian could only use his fastest speed, unrivaled power, and unfathomable extraordinary powers to crush him head-on. However, Zada was completely unaware of this point. He only heard a series of loud clanging sounds, and countless sparks flashed continuously on the weapons of the two combatants. Fang Xinjian and Zada fought each other with speed. Regardless of whether it was the long spear or the steel sword, both of their speeds were getting faster and faster. In a short span of over 10 seconds, they had already turned into a stretch of black afterimages. Regardless of whether it was the long spear or the steel sword, both of them had already broken through the speed of sound. Under the clash of supersonic speed, violent sound waves engulfed the surroundings. The surrounding knights could only feel that every time the spear and sword clashed, there was a huge hammer smashing down on their brains. Most of the knights had no choice but to cover their ears and retreat, only feeling better after they were tens of meters away. Meanwhile, the battle between the two combatants in the circle had already reached its climax. The great spear in Zada's hand was like a black bolt of lightning, roaming around the entire area, filling up every inch of space in the circle. As for Fang Xinjian, he was like an omnipresent air current, continuously striking out with his long spear. Time and time again, he made use of the flaws in his opponent's moves, defeating the strong with the weak, using speed to counter the slow, neutralizing his opponent's attack. After a long while, Zada saw that he was still unable to defeat Fang Xinjian with his killing move. The cold gleam in his eyes grew increasingly intense. Finally, with a flash of lightning, the long spear in his hand exploded with a series of white electric arcs. He had used the killing technique, Thunderbolt's punishment. Under the stimulation of the electric arcs, his speed suddenly increased by 1-fold. His long spear brought about a series of electric sparks, slashing towards Fang Xinjian like a chain of lightning. Fang Xinjian let out a low bellow, similarly performing the killing technique, Supreme Mistwind Sword. Amidst the sword cheese, it was as if there were over 10 Fang Xinjians. Streams of 3 feet sword light, mixed with over 100 streams of sword cheese, clashed against the thunderbolt long spear. At the same time, over 100 streams of sword cheese spread out. The surrounding knights, who were wielding long swords, discovered that the long swords at their waists were trembling violently, and in the next moment they were sent flying by the sword cheese. The muscles all over Fang Xinjian's body swelled up intensely, his vital energy and blood circulating intensely. The long sword in his hand brought about a 3 feet sword light, moving in an extremely graceful trajectory, piercing towards the flaws in Zada's thunderbolt killing technique. With a bang, the violent force repelled Fang Xinjian's longsword. However, the next sword attack, which was sent flying by the sword cheese, had once again struck onto Zada's long spear. Following that, Fang Xinjian stabbed out again and again. Every single sword attack landed on Zada's flaws, leaving Zada with no choice but to save himself, constantly running for his life. Under the continuous attacks, Zada had no chance to catch his breath. After each sword attack, Zada's aura grew increasingly weaker, his strength increasingly weaker. After 13 consecutive sword attacks, the prowess of his spear had already weakened to an extreme. On the other hand, under the reinforcement of the Supreme Mistwind Sword, Fang Xinjian's speed had increased by 3 times. Finally, with a crisp clang, Zada's palm went limp, and the long spear in his hand flew out, flying into the air. Zada let out a cold laugh, and in the next moment, he performed his reduced force field, wanting to grab it back. Chapter 120. The long spear left his hand, and Zada immediately wanted to snatch it back. However, he discovered that tens of sword cheese were aimed at his body's flaws, dashing towards him. If Zada were to ignore it, even if he were to use his reduced force field to grab the long spear, he would definitely be pierced through by the sword cheese. Because the sword chi was simply too fast and too close. Left with no other choice, he could only unleash his reduced force field to block the sword cheese. With a bang, without the long spear, the reduced force field was activated, shattering the sword cheese that were condensed in the air. However, just as he was about to grab back his long spear, with a loud bang, the reduced force field grabbed onto nothing but air. It turned out that while he was blocking the sword cheese, the other sword cheese had directly struck the long spear which was flying in midair, causing the long spear to fly even further away from Zada. It could only be said that Fang Xinjian's attacks were simply too fast. After Zada suffered a setback in a single move, he was suppressed by Fang Xinjian's continuous attacks until he was at a disadvantage. Unable to get his hands on the long spear, Zada decided not to retreat but to advance instead. His entire person seemed to have transformed into a long spear, dashing towards Fang Xinjian, who was surrounded by waves of sword cheese. With a furious bellow, Zada released his reduced force field without any reservations, shattering all the sword cheese in front of him. If Fang Xinjian were to perform his reduced force field and engage in close combat within the circle, relying on his 92 points of strength which far surpassed Fang Xinjian's, he would have been able to gain an advantage. However, if Zada were to rely on his attributes to suppress Fang Xinjian and not care about the profoundness of his moves, he would feel that he had an unfair advantage even if he won. It would be easier for him to be mocked by others. However, now that his long spear had been knocked down, it was no longer the time to be gentlemanly. Zada had completely relied on his reduced force field and his strength attribute to crush Fang Xinjian head-on. In an instant, all the sword cheese were destroyed by him through the air. Following that, he punched out again, and his reduced force field encompassed Fang Xinjian's body, holding him back. Following that, Zada's hand abruptly pierced out like a steel-long spear, piercing through the air and piercing towards Fang Xinjian's body. Zada's series of attacks were completely based on his own strength, using force to suppress others. He didn't care about the intricacies of his moves at all. This was also the countermeasure that most of the knights used when facing enemies who were weaker than them in real battles. They would only talk about techniques when facing enemies with similar attributes. However, just as Zada's lips curled up into a smile and his pistol pierced fiercely into Fang Xinjian's body, his smile suddenly froze. Under the violent momentum, he had no choice but to take another 3 steps before he could stop. He was already standing outside the circle. An afterimage? His speed is actually this fast? Zada turned back and saw Fang Xinjian standing quietly in the circle, but he didn't give chase. If it was a real battle, he wouldn't have lost. However, according to the agreement just now, stepping out of the circle was already a loss. Shaking his head, Zada coldly said, "Fang Xinjian, your sword arts are profound. If I don't use my strength to bully you, it's true that it would be hard for me to win against you. However, don't be too complacent. If we were to engage in a real fight, as long as I can get within 10 meters of you, I'll use my reduced force field and killing techniques to suppress you from the start. I'll be able to kill you within 10 moves." However, Fang Xinjian didn't say a word. He only looked at the longsword in his hand quietly, as if he had silently agreed to Zada's words. Lilia, who was at the side, said unhappily, "Old man, you've been cultivating for so many years and yet you're bullying my teacher, who has only transitioned for less than 2 months. Don't you have any shame? Just tell me, do you admit defeat or not?" "Humph, according to the agreement, I've naturally lost since I stepped out of the circle. However, if we're talking about a real battle of martial arts, I'm naturally not convinced." Zada pointed at Fang Xinjian and said, "Fang Xinjian, what do you say? Why don't we have another match?" If they were to have another match, Zada decided not to hold back anymore. He would use brute force to suppress Fang Xinjian, relying on his high-strength attribute, reduced force field, and killing techniques to defeat his opponent in an instant, not giving him any chance to display his advantage in speed and sword art. Lilia said angrily, "F***ck, old man, don't you have any shame?" Ferdinand also frowned and was about to say something. However, when Fang Xinjian heard this, he shook his head, revealing a disinterested expression. He turned and walked to the back saying, "You're not my match." Hearing Fang Xinjian's words, Zada was enraged. He took a step forward, wanting to chase after him. "Fang Xinjian, you don't dare to have another match with me?" However, before he could finish his words, just as he took this step forward, his body suddenly let out crisp cracking sounds. The upper half of his night attire was instantly shattered, turning into tens of pieces that fell onto the ground. Zada, who was only left with his pants, was stunned. Following that, he felt a lingering fear, as if he had been doused with cold water. He used sword light to slash apart the night attire. In the lightning-fast battle, facing Zada's spear attacks that were like the mountains and seas, using a 3-foot sword light to slash apart the other party's night attire, yet not harming the other party's skin. How fast must one's speed be for one to be able to detect it? How stable and precise must one's sword technique be to be able to tear apart the other party's clothes without being injured? How high must one's martial arts realm be for one to be able to see through the flaws in Zada's spear arts? If he wanted to kill me, he would have already killed me 7 or 8 times earlier. A thought appeared in Zada's mind, causing him to break out in cold sweat. Without saying another word, Zada clasped his hands and left silently. At this moment, he had completely extinguished all thoughts of competing with Fang Xinjian. Fang Xinjian's sword arts talent and martial arts realm were far beyond what he could compare with. When the people in the surroundings saw this scene, they all drew in a cold breath. He can even win like this? Ferdinand's eyes opened wide as he suddenly thought, if even Zada's spear arts can't stop him, then wouldn't my spear arts be like tofu in his eyes, easily pierced through? At this moment, He was extremely glad that he had become friends with Feng Xinjian. Lilia dashed forward, grabbing onto Feng Xinjian's arm and shaking it, her face flushed with excitement. "Teacher, how did you do it earlier? Can you teach me?" Everyone else looked at Feng Xinjian with gazes filled with admiration. This time around, they were completely convinced by Feng Xinjian, and in their hearts, they treated Feng Xinjian as the authority in terms of martial arts. Jack and Anthony even started to suspect if there was anyone else who could defeat Feng Xinjian at the first transition night stage. Anthony shook his head. "I don't know. But at least in our academy, other than Lord Jackson and Master Huang Lin, there's probably no one else who can defeat the god of battle, Feng Xinjian." The news of Zade's defeat spread out very quickly. Therefore, other than the few prefectural champions who had been defeated by Feng Xinjian and their classes, even more night students came to the reflection room, requesting for Feng Xinjian's guidance. This also allowed Feng Xinjian's speed of collecting sword techniques to increase, and he was also getting closer to leveling up his unparalleled sword intent. The first level of the unparalleled sword intent had already made him almost invincible in terms of close combat martial arts. He was very curious about the effects of the leveled-up unparalleled sword intent. And on the third day, Zade also got someone to send over the Empire's divine weapon he had lost. It was a silvery white dagger that had been repeatedly forged using steel that had been tempered 100 times. This dagger was extremely sharp, and it would be a piece of cake for it to slice through gold and jade. This was also the first Empire's divine weapon that Feng Xinjian had obtained, and the first weapon that had a grade. Holding on to this Empire's divine weapon, a stats window suddenly popped up before Feng Xinjian's eyes. It was the introduction of this Empire's divine weapon. Silver Dragon, level 7 abnormally sharp, able to slice through any weapon or armor whose grade was lower than his. This dagger had obviously been prepared by Zade for himself. In actual combat, the moment his opponent managed to sneak up on him and his long spear was no longer useful, he would be able to pull out this dagger and launch a sneak attack. Starting from the Empire's divine weapons, to the inferior remains divine weapons, superior remains divine weapons, and divine remains equipment, all of them had their own grades. Empire's divine weapons from level 1 to 9, inferior remains divine weapons from level 10 to 19, superior remains divine weapons from level 20 to 29, and divine remains equipment from level 30. All of them had different prowess. It was unlike ordinary weapons that were forged, where one could not see the stats window and grade even when holding them in their hands. Feng Xinjian tested the sharpness of this dagger. All the other metal swords were like thick cardboard in front of him, breaking into pieces. However, daggers were different from swords. If Feng Xinjian wanted to use the Silver Dragon, he would have to hold a sword in one hand and a dagger in the other. Only then would he be able to activate the Supreme Mistwind sword and the Single Sword World Subjugation. Usually, he would just keep the Silver Dragon by his waist, so that he could use it whenever he needed to. Many days passed by, and the number of nurturing techniques that Feng Xinjian had collected reached an unprecedented 79 set. He had also picked up Zhou Yong's killing technique, the Radiant Light Sword technique. It was a pity that the time was still too short, and he had not been able to cultivate all of his nurturing techniques to the maximum level. But even so, he had still improved by leaps and bounds during this period of time. The level of his sword arts had risen greatly, and he could now use all sorts of sword techniques with great ease. All martial techniques were filled with flaws before him, unable to withstand a single blow. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.